Before we go any further, before the lore, before the history, before even the names, you should know this one thing. The god who created the Witcher world did not make it whole. He made it broken, not by accident, not through negligence. The conjunction of the spheres was the original wound, and every monster you have ever seen in this world crawled through that wound while it was still bleeding. That is where we begin tonight. Let your body settle now. If you are lying down, feel the weight of you sinking gently into whatever surface holds you. There is nothing you need to carry into the next few hours. The day has taken what it wanted from you, and it is done now. Whatever remains can wait. What cannot wait is 12,000 years of history that has been building, quietly, patiently, toward a single catastrophic moment in the deep past. So breathe slowly, let the thoughts thin out, and come with me to a time before the world was what it is. Once there were many worlds, not as a metaphor, not as a philosopher's fancy. Many worlds, each one sealed inside its own particular sky, turning slowly in the dark between dimensions, unaware of the others. Some of these worlds were old, some were young, some were violent and churning with raw energy, and some were peaceful and still, populated by beings so ancient and so wise that they had long since stopped fighting anything and simply watched the slow drift of their own stars. The world that would become the continent, the world of Geralt, of Ciri, of Yennefer and Triss and every figure you know from this saga, was one of those old worlds, not the oldest, but old enough to have settled into something beautiful, something coherent. It had its own logic, its own magic, its own peoples. It was not waiting for humanity. It was not waiting for anything. It simply was, in the way that old things simply are. And then something happened. Something that the scholars of the continent would later name with the dry precision of men who must name things in order to keep from trembling, the conjunction of the spheres, a cosmic event, a collision, or perhaps an alignment, or perhaps something for which there is no word in any language spoken by any living creature today, in which the boundaries between those sealed and separate worlds simply gave way. Not slowly, not gently. All at once the barriers dissolved, and for a period that may have lasted days or decades or something in between that has no clean name, everything touched everything else. It is worth pausing on that for a moment, really pausing. Not hurrying past it the way we hurry past the opening lines of history, because we are eager to get to the interesting parts. The conjunction of the spheres was not a footnote. It was not background lore. It was the single most consequential event in the history of everything that would ever happen afterward in this world. Every war, every monster, every witcher, every mage, every elf who ever wept over a burning forest or a lost homeland, every human who ever swung a sword or planted a field or burned a village, all of it, every drop of it traces back to that moment when the walls between worlds came down. Think about what that means for the creatures that were minding their own existence in those other spheres when the barriers failed. They did not choose to come here. They did not pack their belongings and emigrate. They were simply caught in the collapse, pulled through the dimensional seams like threads through a needle's eye, and deposited into a world that was not theirs, that did not want them, and that would spend the next several thousand years trying very hard to kill them. This is where the monsters come from, not from darkness, not from evil, not from some cosmic malice that wished suffering upon the living. The monsters of the Witcher world, the Neckers, the vampires, the ghouls, the wraiths, the basilisks, the griffins, all of them, are refugees, accidental immigrants from other spheres, stranded in an alien world without a map, without resources, without any understanding of where they were or how they had arrived there. What looks like monstrousness from the outside is, in many cases, simply the behaviour of a creature trying to survive in a world built for something else entirely. The ancient vampires understood this. The higher vampires, beings of immense intelligence and terrifying patience, arrived through the conjunction and recognised almost immediately that they were not home. They had come from a sphere of perpetual darkness, of specific atmospheric composition, of a particular quality of silence that this new world could not replicate. They adapted. They always adapt. But the adaptation cost them something, and what it cost them is visible in the strange melancholic detachment that the oldest of them carry even now, thousands of years later. Gaunter O'Dim walks this world with the unhurried ease of someone who has been here so long he has forgotten what it felt like to arrive. and yet he arrived the same way everything terrible did, through a wound in the sky that should never have opened. And here is the thought that ought to settle over you gently as you rest tonight, like a blanket lowered slowly from above. The architects of this catastrophe were not villains. There was no villain. The conjunction was not caused by greed or cruelty or the hubris of a sorcerer reaching too far. It was simply what happened when the universe, for reasons it has never explained to anyone, rearranged itself. The great disaster at the heart of the Witcher world is not a moral story. It is a cosmological one. It is the universe making a mistake, or perhaps making a choice we lack the perspective to understand, and then leaving every living thing to sort out the consequences. Geralt knows this, in the wordless way that a man who has spent a century walking through the wreckage of the conjunction knows things. When he sits across from a frightened village elder who wants him to kill whatever is taking livestock from the pastures at the edge of the tree line, he does not think in terms of evil. He thinks in terms of ecology. Something is here that should not be here. That something is hungry. These are the terms of the problem. The moral dimension comes later, if at all, and sometimes it does not come at all. The mistake that made the Witcher world was not a mistake in the ordinary sense. It was not a spilled cup, not a miscalculated spell, not a bridge built on bad foundations. It was a rupture in the fabric of existence so vast and so thorough that it changed the fundamental nature of what this world was. Before the conjunction, the continent was home to elves and dwarves and gnomes and things older still. The bees and the rivers and the deep forest intelligences that have no common name. After the conjunction, it was home to all of that, plus every monster that has ever haunted a nightmare, plus magic drawn from sources no scholar has fully mapped, plus eventually humanity. We should probably linger on that word, eventually. Because humanity did not arrive in the first wave. Humanity arrived in the conjunction like everything else, pulled through without consent, deposited in a new world, confused and frightened and immediately violent. But humanity's particular gift, the thing that separates it from the Neckers and the Wraiths and even the vampires, is that it does not simply adapt. It expands, it fills, it pushes at every edge until the edge gives way. And the world that received humanity through the conjunction was already full. That fullness to the presence of the elder races, the monsters, the old magic, was not a welcome it offered. It was a complication. It was the shape of everything that would follow. Every war between elf and human, every pogrom, every Witcher contract, every mage who reached into the chaos of post-conjunction energy and pulled out something that resembled power but was really just controlled catastrophe. So as you drift now, as your breathing slows and the thoughts begin to soften at their edges, carry this with you. The world of The Witcher is not a world that was designed. It is a world that was broken and then built upon the ruins of its own breaking. Every beautiful thing in it, and there are beautiful things, there are moments of grace that could stop your breath, exists in spite of the wound, not because of it. The wound is still there. It has never fully closed. You can feel it in the magic that runs through this world like a fever that will not quite break. Tonight, we are going to walk backward through the history of that wound. We are going to look at what was here before, and what came through, and what was lost, and what, against all reasonable expectation, somehow survived. Let your watch begin now. The history will not rush. It has waited this long. It can wait a little longer while you find the rest your body is asking for. The stories of the Witcher world did not begin with a Witcher. They began with a silence, a perfect, ancient silence, that was shattered by something no one saw coming, and from that shattered silence everything else was built. There is a specific quality to the silence that preceded the conjunction that is difficult to convey to a mind trained on the world as it currently exists. We are accustomed, all of us, to a world that hums with the low-frequency residue of dimensional catastrophe. The magic in the ley lines, the creatures in the forests, the accumulated strangeness that has become so ordinary we no longer perceive it as strange. To imagine the world before the conjunction is to imagine the removal of that hum, the way you sometimes notice silence only when a sound you had stopped hearing finally stops. The world that was here before the wound was quieter in a way that goes beyond the absence of noise. It was quieter in its fundamental nature. The scholars who have studied the conjunction most rigorously, Alzur, who contributed to the early theoretical frameworks for understanding dimensional energy, and the Ensevern historians among the NLA who possess records no human institution has access to, agree on this much. The conjunction was not a singular event in the sense that it had a before and an after and a specific moment between them. It was a process. It unfolded over a period that may have been as short as a season or as long as a generation, during which the boundaries between spheres thinned further, became permeable, became irrelevant, and then simply were no longer. The creatures that arrived through the collapsing barriers did not all arrive simultaneously. They arrived in waves, the way floodwaters arrive. First the seep, then the trickle, then the thing that cannot be contained. What this means for the history of the continent is that there was no clean moment of before and after. There was a long, terrifying transition during which the world the elder races had known was still recognizable, but increasingly haunted by things that had no place in it. An elf hunter in the deep forests of what would later be called the Blue Mountains might have returned from a week-long journey to find, in the clearing where she had built her shelter, a set of tracks from something that left marks no animal she knew could have made. She would have studied those tracks. She would have followed them far enough to confirm she could not identify their maker. And then she would have returned to her people and described what she had found, and the word that her community would have used for what was happening, the closest translation available from the oldest Insaida dialect, means roughly, the world is admitting things it has not chosen. That phrase has always struck me as the most accurate summary of the conjunction of the spheres. Not catastrophe, not disaster, not attack, just the world admitting things it had not chosen. The elements of this story that feel most tragic are the ones that were not malicious. The creatures that came through did not come to destroy. The magic that flooded in did not come to corrupt. The humans who would eventually follow did not come to conquer, at least not initially. The world was simply breached, and everything that poured through the breach was doing nothing more complicated than surviving. The tragedy of the Witcher world is the tragedy of incompatible things in an insufficient space, each of them doing what it was built to do, each act of mere survival constituting an invasion in the eyes of everything already present. Gilles, in one of his more contemplative recorded conversations, preserved in an NL archive that Ciri glimpsed briefly during her time among them, without fully understanding what she was reading, described the conjunction as the universe's equivalent of a bad night, not evil, not designed. Just a night in which everything that could go wrong chose to go wrong simultaneously, and the morning that followed was so different from the previous day that the word morning hardly seemed adequate. He said this without drama. He said it the way very old people describe very old disasters, with the particular flatness of someone who's had time to understand that outrage requires energy, that is better spent on other things. You're resting now in the world that the bad night made. Every comfort you have, every piece of civilization that surrounds you, every relationship and institution and tradition, all of it was built on the morning after. Built by people who had no choice but to build, because the world that existed before the wound was gone, and the world that replaced it needed tending. This is, in its way, a profound form of resilience. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that appears in songs, but the kind that shows up every morning and does what needs doing in the available world. The continent tonight is quiet. The monsters are in their places, the mages are in their towers, the witchers are on their roads. The wound in the world's fabric is still there, as it has always been, but it is not bleeding. It has learned, over 12,000 years, to hold itself still. And in the stillness the world is almost enough. Almost, and sometimes more than almost, and occasionally, in the right light, at the right moment, in the presence of the right people, genuinely and entirely enough. Here is a question that will keep gently. If you could return to a world before it was damaged, would it feel like paradise? Or would it simply feel quiet? Here is a question worth carrying into the quiet with you tonight. What does a world look like before it is broken? Not a perfect world, not a paradise, but a world that has had enough time to settle into itself, to develop its own rhythms, its own hierarchies, its own slow and patient understanding of what it is. That is what the continent was once, before the conjunction, before the monsters, before the humans, a world that had found something close to equilibrium. And it is worth knowing what was lost, because nothing you will encounter in Geralt's story makes complete sense without that knowledge. Let your breathing find its natural pace now, not forced, not counted, just the slow, involuntary rise and fall of a body beginning to release the day. The room around you is quiet enough, the dark is gentle enough, And the world I'm about to describe to you is 3,000 years gone, which means it can do you no harm. It exists now only in the memory of the very old and the very bitter, and in certain songs that elves still sing when they think no one is listening. The elves arrived on the continent long before the conjunction, though the precise mechanism of their arrival is one of those historical questions that grows thornier the more carefully you examine it. Some of the oldest Enceda oral traditions speak of crossing the sea from another landmass, a migration by ship and by will, driven by some impulse that the surviving songs describe only in metaphor, a call, a longing, a sense that the land they were coming to was already theirs in some way they could not articulate. They arrived to a continent already inhabited by dwarves, by gnomes, by halflings, and a dozen other peoples who had been here longer still, or had at least been here long enough to have settled into the stone and the soil with the permanence of things that belong. The dwarves in particular had been in the mountains for so long that the mountains themselves seemed to have arranged their contours to accommodate them. The great dwarven holds of Mahakam and the other ranges were not constructed in opposition to the landscape. They were grown from it, the way stalactites grow, slowly, over time, through the patient accumulation of work and habit and the particular genius of a people who understood stone the way other peoples understand language. What the elves brought, and what the dwarves had perhaps in lesser abundance, was magic, not the chaos-fueled sorcery that would emerge after the conjunction, something older, quieter, more thoroughly woven into the world's own nature. The Unseda were not scholars of magic so much as participants in it. They did not study the forces of the world. They moved with those forces the way a swimmer moves with a current rather than fighting it. Their cities, Dol Blathana before humanity swallowed it, the hidden places in the deep forest that do not appear on any human map, were not built on top of the landscape but into it, as if the trees and the hills had offered the space willingly. There is a Dol Blathana that the elves remember, and then there is the Dol Blathana that humans know, and they are not the same place. They occupy the same geography, but the geography has been changed, cleared, levelled, organised according to human logic, until almost nothing of what it was remains. What remains exists in the memory of Francesca Finderbear, one of the last elf rulers, who carries the weight of that lost world with the particular stillness of someone who has grieved so long that the grief has become structural. It is not an emotion she feels, it is a fact she inhabits. This is the thing that is hardest to understand about the elder races from a human perspective. Their relationship to time is not like ours. Humans live at most 7 or 8 decades, and we experience those decades as urgency, the sense that there is never quite enough time, that the clock is always running, that we must hurry or be left behind. Elves live for centuries, some live for millennia. And what that does to a mind, to a soul, is not simply to extend the human experience across a longer span. It changes the texture of experience entirely. An elf who watches a human city rise over the ruins of an elven grove has lived long enough to have watched other things rise and fall. They have learned, through accumulated experience, that what rises will fall, and what falls will be forgotten. This could make them wise. It sometimes does, but it also makes them tired in a way that goes deeper than physical fatigue. The Unseda who remain on the continent at the time of Geralt's story are not simply displaced, they are exhausted. They are carrying the memory of a world that existed in fullness and beauty and coherence, and they are carrying it through a present that looks like the ruin of that world at every turn. It is worth pausing there for a moment. Let the scale of that settle, without trying to resolve it. An elf who was alive before the first human ship reached these shores, and there are a handful who were, if barely, has watched a world transform over the course of thousands of years from something that was theirs into something that barely contains them. They are guests in a history that used to be their own. The bitterness this produces is not irrational. It is arithmetic. The gnomes had a different relationship to the transformation. Practical by nature, obsessively, almost aggressively practical, they found ways to coexist with each new wave of change that the conjunction and humanity brought, not because they were content with their diminished circumstances, but because they possessed, in their engineering and their commerce, and their particular genius for making things work, enough leverage to maintain a foothold in the world, regardless of who was nominally in charge of it. The gnomes who traded in Novigrad or built the mechanisms that powered the mage academies were not happy about the state of the world, but they were present in it, and presence is its own form of survival. What none of them could have anticipated, Not the elves, not the dwarves, not the gnomes, not the deep forest intelligences that had no name in any language spoken by anything with a human shape, was what the conjunction would bring. They were not naive about danger. They had seen storms and droughts, and the slow migrations of peoples across the land. But the conjunction was not a storm. It was not a drought. It was a fundamental alteration of the rules by which the world operated. It brought magic of a kind that had never existed here before. It brought creatures from other spheres, and it brought humanity. Of the three, magic was perhaps the easiest to absorb. The elder races already understood something they called magic. What the conjunction added was chaos, raw dimensional energy that had leaked through the collapsed barriers between spheres. This new magic was louder, more volatile, more immediately powerful than anything the elves had practiced in their long centuries of refinement. Some among them took to it. Some were horrified by it. Most recognized it for what it was, a symptom of the damage, not a gift. Francesca Findabair, who would later become one of the great mages of the post-conjunction world, draws her power from both streams, the ancient elven attunement to natural forces and the raw chaos energy that the conjunction deposited in the world's ley lines. She is, in this sense, a living synthesis of before and after, a woman who contains both the world that was lost and the world that replaced it, and who has spent her entire very long life trying to reconcile the two. Ciri will feel this too much later, though she will not have the context to understand what she is feeling. When she runs through a forest that was once elven and is now human, when she passes through places where the old magic is still concentrated in the soil and the water, she feels something that she cannot name, a resonance, an echo of a world she never knew, but that somehow knows her. This is the elder blood working in her. It is the conjunction's legacy passing through 1,000 years of bloodlines to arrive, transformed beyond recognition, in the body of a frightened teenager running from everything at once. Breathe slowly now. The world before the conjunction is gone, and has been gone for longer than any human civilization has existed. But it is not entirely absent. It persists in fragments, in the songs the elves still sing, in the old stone of the dwarven holds, in the deep-rooted trees of the Broccolon forest where the dryads keep a kind of vigil that is half mourning and half defiance. It persists in Ciri's blood. It persists in the particular quality of silence that you sometimes find in very old places where the newer world has not yet fully colonized the air. That silence is where the elder races still live, in a sense. Not the physical world, that was taken from them, piece by piece, over centuries of pressure and violence and the slow administrative erasure that is how most things are actually destroyed. But the silence, the particular texture of a world that had time to become itself before being broken open and reassembled by forces it did not invite. Rest here for a moment, in that silence. There is no urgency in the deep past. There is only the long, slow breathing of a world that was, for a while, for a good long while, enough. The dryads of Broccolon are in many ways the purest surviving expression of what the elder world was before the conjunction. They are not Ansaida. They predate the elven migration to the continent, or at least this is what the oldest Ansaida oral accounts imply, in the roundabout way that elven oral accounts imply things they are not entirely certain of. The dryads do not offer linear history. They offer presence, the weight of a forest that has been here longer than anything human, or elven, or even reliably nameable. When Ciri encounters them, she encounters something that has no conceptual framework for what happened to the world, because the dryads' conceptual framework predates the frameworks. They know the forest was different once. They know the world was different. They carry the difference not as grief exactly, but as a texture, the way old wood carries the texture of the grain that was in it before it was made into anything. The gnomish archives at Mahakam contain, among their engineering records and trade logs, a collection of oral histories so old that the transcription process itself consumed 2 generations of dedicated scholars. These histories speak of a time before the dwarves were dwarves, in the sense we use the word, before the mountain holds, before the forges, before the extraordinary metallurgical tradition that would make dwarven craftsmanship the benchmark against which all other metalwork is measured. They speak of a time when the beings who had become dwarves lived differently, in a relationship with the stone that was less architectural and more, the transcribers struggled with the word, conversational. They spoke to the mountains in this telling. and the mountains, in ways the histories do not specify, spoke back. Whether this is literal or metaphorical is a question that the Gnomish archivists who compiled the collection declined to answer, on the grounds that the distinction between literal and metaphorical is a human cognitive habit that does not map cleanly onto the worldview that produced these histories. What matters, they noted in their editorial commentary, is not whether the mountains actually spoke, but what it tells us about the relationship between the pre-conjunction elder races and the natural world they inhabited. They were not separate from it. They were woven into it, the way a thread is woven into a cloth, part of the structure, defining it, defined by it, neither fully individual nor fully dissolved. The conjunction's most immediate disruption of this relationship was the introduction of chaos magic, the dimensional energy that flooded in through the collapsing barriers between spheres. For beings whose magic was rooted in the natural world's own energies, this new force was not simply powerful. It was alien. It did not speak the same language as the earth attunement of the dwarves or the forest communion of the dryads or the starlight reading of the oldest Enseda practitioners. It spoke a language of raw force, of dimensional physics, of energies that had originated in a dozen different spheres and carried the residue of a dozen different cosmological systems. It was a babel of power, and sorting it into something comprehensible would take centuries. Falka, whose rebellion burns at the edges of this period like a fire in a peripheral room, is significant not because of her specific acts, but because of what her story represents about how quickly the political landscape shifted after the human flood. Within a few generations of the first significant human settlements, there was already a human civil war complex enough to involve betrayal, dynastic politics, magical manipulation, and the kind of atrocity that gets named after the people who committed it. This is how fast humanity moved. The elder races, who had been managing their own politics across centuries, watched this acceleration with something between fascination and horror. The way you might watch a small but extremely energetic animal running in circles, impressed by the output and unclear about the direction. The forest that remained from the pre-conjunction era, Broccolon chief among them, the sacred groves that the druids tend, certain unnamed places in the mountains where the old magic is still so concentrated it affects the behaviour of anyone who enters them, are not simply ecological preserves. They are archives. They contain, in their accumulated growth and their particular silence, information about what this world was before it became what it is. You cannot read that information the way you read a book. You have to stand in it and let it reach you at a level below the analytical, the way music reaches you before you have had time to decide how you feel about it. The world before the conjunction was not perfect. The elder races had their conflicts, their failures of wisdom, their moments of cruelty and narrowness. They were not idealized predecessors any more than humanity is uniquely fallen. But they had had time to make mistakes and learn from them, time to develop philosophies that accommodated the full span of a very long life, time to understand the difference between urgency and importance, which is perhaps the most difficult thing to learn, and the thing humanity, with its compressed lifespans, most consistently struggles with. That time is what was lost. The conjunction did not destroy the elder races, not immediately, not directly. It simply began the process of taking their time from them. What if the conquerors never thought of themselves as conquerors? What if they simply thought, there is land here, and we need land? What if the conquerors never thought of themselves as conquerors? This question has no clean answer, but it is worth carrying as we move into the next chapter of this history. The arrival of humanity on the continent, which the elder races experienced as a catastrophe, and which humanity experienced as something much simpler and more mundane, survival. Most of the violence that shapes the Witcher world was committed by people who believed, with genuine conviction, that they had no choice. Let your shoulders drop now. If you have been holding any tension in your jaw or your neck, let it soften. The history ahead of us is long, and there is no benefit to meeting it tense. The humans who arrived on the continent through the conjunction were frightened. They were disoriented. They were the survivors of an event they could not explain, deposited in a world they did not recognize, surrounded by creatures both magnificent and terrible. They did what frightened, disoriented survivors do. They clung to each other. They built walls, and they expanded until the walls were no longer necessary, because the land beyond them had become theirs. It did not happen all at once. The historians who try to reduce it to a single moment, the first landing, the Great Migration, whatever label the current political climate finds most comfortable, are simplifying a process that took centuries and was, for most of those involved, not experienced as history at all but as ordinary life. A farmer clears a field, a village grows into a town, a road gets built between two towns because it is inconvenient not to have one. None of these acts feels like conquest. None of them requires the farmer or the road builder to think of themselves as an invader. And yet, in aggregate, across generations, they constitute the occupation of an entire continent. The elder races noticed, of course. They noticed from the first human settlement that went up in what had been elven forest, noticed the smoke from the fires that cleared the land, noticed the absence of trees that had been standing since before any human's great-great-grandmother was born. They did not initially react with violence. This is the part of the history that human sources tend to omit. The first responses of the Aenseda to human encroachment were diplomatic. They sent emissaries. They negotiated. They attempted to establish boundaries and agreements through conversation, which was the method that had served them adequately in their relations with dwarves and gnomes over the preceding millennia. The humans were not, in general, interested in negotiation. Not because they were uniquely cruel, they were not, but because their relationship to time made the concept of long-term agreement feel abstract in a way it did not feel to creatures who could personally verify whether an agreement made 500 years ago was still being honoured. An elf could say, "We agreed, in the reign of such and such, that this forest would remain uncut." A human could only say, "I don't know anything about that agreement and I need firewood." Both of these statements are true. Neither of them resolves anything. The wars that followed were not, strictly speaking, wars in the conventional sense. They were more like weather, recurring, devastating, impossible to prevent, and impossible to fully explain to someone who has not lived through one. The Falka Rebellion, which flares at the edges of this period, is named for a human, which tells you something about how thoroughly history had already shifted in its centre of gravity by that point. By the time humans were having civil wars with each other, the question of what had been done to the elder races was already being filed under history. Unfortunate, but concluded. The dwarves adapted as dwarves do by retreating deeper into the mountains and making themselves economically indispensable. If you controlled the ore and the forges, humanity would find ways to do business with you regardless of its feelings about your continued existence. It was not dignity exactly, but it was leverage, and leverage was something dwarves understood at an elemental level. The gnomes followed a similar logic. They were small, they were clever, and they were willing to be useful to whoever was in charge, which meant that whoever was in charge generally tolerated them. The elves had a harder time with the calculus of survival, because their dignity was bound up with their land in a way that the dwarves was not. For the Aenseda, the forest was not a resource, and it was not simply a home. It was the medium through which their culture, their magic, their identity as a people expressed itself. To be separated from the old forests was not merely to be displaced, it was to be partially erased. The elves who survived the centuries of human expansion survived as diminished versions of what their people had been. Not in intelligence, not in capacity, but in the particular fullness that comes from living in a world that reflects who you are back at you. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. The quiet kind of sitting, not the analytical kind. The elves of the Witcher world are not tragic figures in the operatic sense. They do not perform their grief. They carry it the way you carry an old injury. It is not always visible, but it informs the way you move through the world. When Filavandrel, the elven king reduced to banditry in the mountains, sits across from Geralt and speaks about what has been lost, he does not cry. He does not rage. He speaks with the flat precision of a man describing a wound that has been dressed so many times that the dressing has become habit. Geralt listens to him. This is not nothing. The Witcher, who was born human and made into something else, who stands at the intersection of every category the world uses to divide itself, has a particular capacity for hearing people who are not typically heard. He does not offer Filavandrel solutions. He does not tell him it will get better. He simply extends the human quality of attention to a member of a people who have been told in every available language that their perspective does not count for very much anymore. Ciri, who carries the elder blood, and who will spend much of her life being claimed by various factions as the answer to their particular questions, will come to understand the elven experience in a different way. She's both the child of human royalty and the inheritor of the most ancient elven bloodline on the continent. She is, in herself, the impossible synthesis of the two histories, the one that conquered and the one that was conquered. This does not resolve the contradiction. Nothing resolves the contradiction. But it makes her capable of a kind of empathy that most purely human characters cannot access, because she carries both sides of the wound simultaneously. The human kingdoms that emerged on the continent did so with remarkable speed, which is perhaps the most distinctively human thing about them. Cintra, Temeria, Redania, Nilfgaard, each of these names represents not just a political entity but a process, a centuries-long accumulation of cleared forests and built roads and fought wars and negotiated marriages and accumulated grievances that eventually coalesced into something that called itself a nation. The elder races watched this happen with a mixture of admiration and despair, the same mixture you might feel watching something very fast and very strong move through a space it does not fully understand. Nilfgaard, which will become the most powerful empire the continent has ever seen, began as one of many human successor states, no more remarkable than any other, distinguished primarily by geography and the particular ambition of its early rulers. The thing that made Nilfgaard different was not its origins, it was its patience. It was willing to wait, to consolidate, to build, to wait again. In this, of all human political entities, it most resembled the elder races, and this is not a coincidence. The traditions of the Imperial South absorbed certain elven administrative practices that other human kingdoms were too proud to acknowledge, let alone adopt. All of this, the expansion, the displacement, the wars, the patience, the slow replacement of one world with another, happened against the backdrop of the conjunction's ongoing consequences. The monsters were still here, they were still hungry, they were still emerging from the deep forests and the mountain passes and the abandoned places where the dimensional wounds had deposited them, and they needed to be dealt with. The elder races had developed their own methods. Humanity, newly arrived and in need of solutions faster than tradition could provide, would develop something new. Rest now in the knowledge that history does not require your participation to continue. It moves like water, around obstacles, through gaps, always finding the path of least resistance, always arriving eventually at the sea. The humans who arrived on the continent were not different in kind from the people who had been here before them. They simply arrived at the wrong moment, in the wrong numbers, with the wrong relationship to the concept of enough. The world that received them was already bruised from the conjunction. The flood of humanity was one more thing it had to absorb, and it did absorb it. The way old wood absorbs water, slowly, completely, until you cannot tell where the water ends and the wood begins. That is tonight's thought to carry into sleep. Two histories, pressed together until they cannot be separated, and somewhere in the seam between them, a witcher is walking. He is always walking. The Cintran royal line is the most consequential human dynasty in the history of the continent, and not primarily because of its military prowess or its political acumen, though both were considerable. It is consequential because it was the vessel. The lineage through which the elder blood flowed from Lara Doran's half-elven child, down through the generations to Calanthe, to Pavetta, to Ciri. Every king and queen who sat the Cintran throne was, without knowing it, a courier in a delivery that had been in transit for 1,000 years. They built their kingdom, they fought their wars, they signed their treaties and made their marriages and did all the things that rulers do, and beneath all of it, in the blood that moved through the royal line with each new generation, the elder blood was travelling toward its destination. Calanthe, the lioness of Cintra, is one of the most fully realised political figures in the Witcher world precisely because she is fully human in her ambitions, while being partially elven in her inheritance, and she's entirely unaware of the latter. She is pragmatic, fierce, calculating, capable of great warmth and considerable ruthlessness, in roughly equal measure depending on what the situation requires. She is exactly the kind of ruler that the continent's particular historical moment produces. Someone who understands that the difference between a kingdom that survives and one that does not is the quality of its decision-making in moments of crisis, and who has trained herself, over a long career of crisis management, to make those decisions without the luxury of certainty. What she could not manage, and this is perhaps the most humanly recognizable thing about her, was the destiny that surrounded her daughter Pavetta, and then her granddaughter Ciri. She tried. She tried in the way that capable, controlling people try to manage things that are not controllable. By increasing the intensity of the effort, rather than questioning the premise, she kept Ciri close. She kept the secret of the elder blood close. She arranged, insofar as anyone can arrange the law of surprise, for Geralt's claim on her granddaughter to be honoured, because some part of her understood, without having the theoretical framework for what she understood, that Ciri would need protection of a kind that she herself could not provide. The Lioness of Cintra spent her last living years trying to secure a future for a child whose future was already determined by forces she could feel but could not name. The human kingdoms that emerged from the centuries after the first landing are diverse in their political structures, their cultures, their relationships to magic and to the elder races, but they share a quality that distinguishes them from anything the elder races built. They are organized around the assumption of brevity. Human institutions, kingdoms, churches, trade guilds, legal frameworks, are designed at some deep structural level to survive their founders. They are built to transfer, to persist across generational change, to maintain coherence when the people who created them are gone. This is the genius of human civilization, and also its characteristic vice. The institutions persist past the circumstances that justified them, accumulate authority that was meant to be temporary, and become ends in themselves, long after the ends they were meant to serve have changed. The Church of the Eternal Fire, which would become one of the most powerful institutions on the continent, began as a local cult and expanded through the human settlements with the particular efficiency of an organization that had identified a market need, the need for a framework that made human mortality feel meaningful, and had developed a product that addressed it. Its relationship to the persecution of non-humans is not incidental to its theology. It is its theology, or at least the theological convenience that allows it to generate the fear that is its primary organizational fuel. Fear of the other, focused and named and given a face that is not human, is easier to sustain than any more abstract theological proposition. The elder races suffered for this utility. They continue to suffer for it. The Nilfgaardian Empire's relationship to the elder races is more complicated than the northern kingdoms and receives less attention because complexity is less comfortable than the simple narrative of oppressor and oppressed. Nilfgaard absorbed elven administrative techniques. It retained certain Ensaida scholars in positions of genuine influence. It was not tolerant of elder races in the sense of regarding them as equals. No human political institution was. But it was pragmatic about them in the sense of being willing to use what they had to offer, which is its own kind of acknowledgement of value. This pragmatism did not prevent imperial armies from raising elven settlements when the military situation required it, but it prevented the systematic ideological dehumanization of non-humans that characterized the Northern Church's approach, which meant that more individual non-humans survived under Nilfgaardian administration than under the theocratic models further north. Geralt moves through the human political landscape with the detachment of someone who has watched enough versions of the same argument to have stopped finding them interesting. He does not hate Nilfgaard. He does not love the Northern Kingdoms. He has seen them all from the road, which is the view that neither the capitals nor the villages provide. The view of the in-between places, the border territories, the communities that are claimed by whoever is currently winning and pay taxes to whoever is currently capable of collecting them. From the road, the difference between Nilfgaard and Temeria is less than their propagandists would like and more than their victims would prefer. Both produce roads. Both produce orphans. What would you sacrifice for power? And, the more difficult question, what would you sacrifice to keep it? What would you sacrifice for power? This question has a clean, obvious answer when you first encounter it. Nothing, or nothing important, or nothing that matters more than who I am. But the mages of the Witcher world sat with this question long enough to discover that it has a second, quieter version underneath the first one. What would you sacrifice to keep it? That second question is harder. That is where the real story lives. Feel your breathing now. Feel it without trying to change it. Just the simple fact of air moving in, air moving out, the body doing what it was built to do without any instruction from you. The mages spent lifetimes trying to master forces that the body was not built to do, and the cost of that mastery is written into every one of them in ways they cannot always see. We are going to look at those costs tonight with the kind of attention they deserve, not with judgment, not with pity, but with the particular quality of understanding that only comes at this hour, when the world is quiet and the mind is open. The chaos energy that flooded the continent during the conjunction did not distribute itself evenly. It settled into certain geographic locations with higher concentration, into the ley lines beneath the earth, into bodies of water, into the stones of certain hills that had been sacred to the elder races for reasons they could feel but not always explain. It also settled into certain people. A small percentage of the population, in the immediate post-conjunction period, no one knew what percentage, but retrospective analysis suggests something close to 1 in 1,000, carried a genetic predisposition that allowed them to perceive and interact with this new energy. These were the first mages. They did not know they were mages. They knew they were different, that they could feel things others could not feel, that sometimes when they reached for something it moved before their hand arrived, that they dreamed in colours that did not exist in waking life. In early post-conjunction society, this difference was regarded with a mixture of awe and suspicion that tilted heavily toward the latter. Being able to do things other people cannot do has never historically been an uncomplicated advantage. The organisation that would become the Brotherhood of Sorcerers, and later fragment into the competing chapters of mages that exist in Geralt's time, emerged from the practical necessity of managing these individuals and their abilities. Someone had to. The chaos energy was real, it was powerful, and it was dangerous in the hands of the untrained. A child who could not yet control their gift might level a building or incinerate a field, or call down lightning from a clear sky without meaning to. The Brotherhood provided structure. It provided education. It provided the framework within which magical ability could be transformed from a liability into an asset. What it also provided, though this was not part of any official charter, was a mechanism for the consolidation of political power. Mages who were trained in the Brotherhood's methods were useful to kings. Kings who had access to trained mages were more powerful than kings who did not. The relationship that developed over the centuries between magical institutions and political power is one of the most consequential and most carefully obscured threads in the continent's history. The mages needed the king's protection and resources. The kings needed the mages' capabilities. Neither side liked acknowledging how thoroughly they needed the other, so both sides maintained a fiction of independence that was transparent to anyone paying attention. Desire de Vries understood this better than almost anyone. The Rectoress of Aretusa, the Academy for Female Mages, built on a cliffside over the sea that you can almost smell if you close your eyes and breathe slowly, was not naive about the transaction she was facilitating. She transformed young women with gifts into instruments of political power. She knew it. She was honest about it with herself in ways that she could not always be honest about it with her students, because what the students needed was to believe that the power was theirs. Yennefer was one of her students, and Yennefer's transformation, which we will return to in much greater depth later tonight, is the clearest and most intimate account we have of what the accumulation of magical power actually costs, not in abstract political terms, in the terms of the body, of the self, of the particular person you were before the magic remade you into something more capable and less complete. The Brotherhood's reach extended across the continent in a way that the individual human kingdoms did not. While Temeria and Redania fought over borders, and Nilfgaard expanded its imperial perimeter, the mages moved between states with a freedom that almost no one else possessed. This freedom was a mark of their value and a symbol of their power, but it was also, when you look at it closely, a kind of exile. The mages did not belong to any nation because any nation that claimed them entirely would also have to take responsibility for them, and taking responsibility for mages was not something kingdoms generally wanted to do. Better to use them and leave the question of belonging diplomatically ambiguous. The chapter of the gift and the art, the governing body of the Brotherhood in the period that concerns us most, presided over this ambiguity with the particular institutional competence of an organisation that has survived longer than any of its members. It was not good at moral questions. It was very good at survival. And survival, for an organisation of mages in a world that had never quite made its peace with magic, required a constant calibration of when to advise, when to intervene, and when to become strategically invisible. Geralt distrusts mages. This is not irrational. He has lived long enough to see the chapter prioritize its own institutional interests above the welfare of the people it claimed to serve, repeatedly and with remarkable consistency. He has seen mages treat the kingdoms of the continent as a board game, moving pieces that happen to be made of human lives. He has also watched Yennefer, whom he loves with the complicated and sometimes combustive devotion that is his particular genius, demonstrate that the magic does not erase the person. It just makes the person much harder to see through the brightness of it. Triss Merigold is easier to read than Yennefer. Her warmth is more accessible, her vulnerabilities more visible, her politics more transparent. She is a younger mage, trained in an era when the Brotherhood's self-confidence had begun to erode under the pressure of events it had not predicted. She carries the humility of someone who has seen the great institutions of the world fail at crucial moments and has had to decide, in the absence of the institutional answer, what she actually believes. What she believes, it turns out, is in the people immediately in front of her. This makes her a less effective political operator than Yennefer, and a more effective human being. The chaos magic itself, the raw dimensional energy that the conjunction deposited in this world, has never been fully understood by anyone who uses it. This is the irony at the heart of every mage's expertise. They are masters of a force whose origins they cannot explain, drawing on energy from a wound in reality that has never been properly examined, let alone healed. The most rigorous scholarship on the subject, produced by the best minds the Brotherhood has ever trained, amounts to an increasingly precise description of an effect whose cause remains opaque. They know what it does. They do not know what it is. This should perhaps induce humility. For the most part, it does not. The temperament required to be an effective mage, the willingness to reach into forces that could kill you, to maintain concentration under pressure, to accept the cost of transformation, is not, in general, a temperament predisposed to humility. The mages of the Witcher world are, almost without exception, brilliant, capable, traumatized, and arrogant in roughly that order, with the proportions varying by individual. If you are still with us, still half awake, still listening, then you already know how to let a story carry you. Let this one carry you further. Subscribe, so the next chapter is waiting when you return. The history will keep. Sleep well. The Brotherhood will eventually fracture, as things built on ambiguity tend to fracture. The Lodge of Sorceresses will emerge from the wreckage, attempting to consolidate female magical power in a world where female political power has always been subordinated to male authority, through the convenient claim that women cannot be trusted with it. The Lodge's methods will not always be defensible, but its existence is comprehensible, which is the precondition for being defensible in the first place. For now, though, rest. The mages are arguing in their councils. The chapter is meeting behind closed doors. The chaos energy is moving through the ley lines beneath the earth, patient as groundwater, indifferent to the uses to which it is put. And somewhere on the road between one small town and another, a Witcher is riding, carrying the accumulated weight of a world that made him for a purpose it has never quite acknowledged, and would not, if pressed, defend. Aretusa sits on an island off the coast of Temeria, or rather, the island sits under Aretusa, because the Academy was built in the manner of things that intend to last. Foundations first, deep and uncompromising, and then everything else in whatever arrangement the moment required. The building is old enough that its original architects are unknown. The magic embedded in its stones is old enough that the mages who study it now cannot always determine which effects are designed and which are simply accumulations. Centuries of concentrated magical practice leaving residue the way centuries of cooking leave residue in a kitchen's walls. Aretusa smells like chalk and salt and something that has no name in any language that does not include the word magic. The young women who arrive there, girls mostly between 12 and 16, identified through the Brotherhood's network of recruiters and assessors as carriers of the gift, arrive not knowing what they are walking into. Some of them have been prepared by their families, some have not. The preparation, when it exists, tends toward the optimistic. Your talent will be developed. You will learn to control what has been uncontrollable. You will emerge capable of things that ordinary people cannot do. What the preparation rarely includes is any honest account of what control costs, or what the transformation requires, or what will be expected of the person who emerges from the process in exchange for the capability she has been given. Tisaya de Vries is honest about this with herself, and selectively honest about it with her students. She knows what the process costs. She knows it because she went through it, because she has watched every student since go through it, because the cost is visible in the people who emerge and is the kind of thing you cannot watch repeatedly without developing a precise understanding of its dimensions. What she does not do is share this understanding fully with the students before they undergo the process, on grounds that are coherent even if they are not entirely ethical. A student who knows all the costs in advance is less likely to commit fully to the training, and a mage who does not commit fully is a mage who is dangerous to themselves and everyone around them. The institutional logic is sound. The individual cost is real. The male counterpart to Aretusa, the school at Banard which trained male mages under conditions that were different in detail but similar in underlying philosophy, produced its own catalogue of transformed individuals. The difference in the transformation between male and female mages is not primarily magical, it is social. A male mage who emerged from Banard transformed entered a world in which transformed, powerful men had existing templates and existing roles. A female mage who emerged from Aretusa transformed entered a world in which the templates for powerful women were much narrower, and the roles were much more constrained, and the gap between what she was capable of and what she was permitted to openly be was the space in which the Lodge of Sorceresses would eventually plant its foundations. The Lodge was not, as its detractors claimed, a conspiracy. It was an institution built on the recognition that female magical power, operating through the official channels of the Brotherhood, was systematically undervalued and strategically constrained. Its members, Yennefer, Triss, Francesca Findabair, Sabrina Glevissig, Philippa Eilhart and others, were not uniformly sympathetic figures. Several of them made choices that are difficult to defend on any grounds other than political necessity, and political necessity is a ground that admits almost anything if you apply sufficient pressure. But the Lodge existed because it needed to exist, because the world it operated in had created a need for it, and that need was real regardless of the imperfection of the institution it produced. Philippa Eilhart is the Lodge's most politically sophisticated member, and its most morally complicated one, a mage of extraordinary capability whose ambitions extended well beyond the conventional scope of magical scholarship into the realm of direct political engineering. She treated kings the way chess players treat knights, useful pieces, valuable within specific parameters, replaceable when those parameters were exceeded. Her treatment of Radovid, the young king whose madness she helped cultivate or failed to prevent, depending on how generously you read the evidence, is the most consequential of her political interventions and the one that most clearly illustrates the Lodge's fundamental strategic error, the belief that controlling the powerful is a stable equilibrium rather than a temporary advantage. The mages who survived the events of the Witcher saga's political climax, the ones who were still standing when the empires had finished reorganizing and the Lodge had been scattered, were survivors in the truest sense, not the ones with the most power, but the ones with the most accurate understanding of when to apply power and when to step back. Triss Merigold survived because her fundamental commitment was to people rather than institutions. Yennefer survived because she is Yennefer, which is its own explanation and requires no further elaboration. If you are still with us, still half awake, still listening, then you already know how to let a story carry you. Let this one carry you further. Subscribe, so the next chapter is waiting when you return. The history will keep. Sleep well. Consider this. Humanity created the monsters of this world, not by malice, but by arriving. And then, not knowing what else to do, it created something to kill them, a monster to fight the monsters. But what happens when that monster turns out to have a soul? Consider this. Humanity created the monsters of this world, not by malice, but by arriving. The conjunction deposited them, but it was humanity's expansion that disrupted the delicate, terrible ecology that had begun to establish itself between the elder races and the creatures from other spheres. The humans pushed the monsters out of their natural ranges, forced them into human-occupied territory, created the conditions for conflict that had not previously existed. And then, not knowing what else to do, humanity created something to fight them, a monster to fight the monsters. But what happens when that monster turns out to have a soul? Let the weight of you settle now, completely. There is a particular kind of release that comes at this hour, when the body finally accepts that the day is over and that it's allowed to stop. Let that release happen. The muscles you have been holding all day can let go. The thoughts you have been managing can drift. What remains is a quieter kind of attention, and that is exactly what this part of the story requires. The Witcher mutations were not the first attempt to create human beings capable of surviving monster encounters. They were preceded by decades of other approaches: better armor, better weapons, better tactics, organized hunting parties, payment systems designed to attract experienced fighters. All of these helped. None of them were sufficient. The monsters that had arrived through the conjunction were not, in general, susceptible to solutions that had been designed for human opponents. They were too fast, too strong, too alien in their behavior, too numerous in their ecological variety. Fighting a Necker required completely different knowledge than fighting a Bruxa, which required different knowledge still than managing a Djinn or a Leshen. There was simply too much to know, and no ordinary human could hold enough of it while also being fast enough to survive the encounter. The mages who developed the Witcher mutations, and it was mages, working with the early precursors of what would become the School of the Wolf at Kaer Morhen, understood the problem clearly. They needed something that combined the adaptability of a human mind with physical capabilities that exceeded human limitations. Enhanced senses that could detect a Strigger's presence before the Strigger detected them. Reflexes that did not require the half-second cognitive delay that cost ordinary humans their lives in close combat. A metabolism that could handle the mutagenic substances, the decoctions and preparations that granted temporary access to specific monstrous capabilities without being destroyed by them. The mutations did all of this. They also, almost certainly unintentionally, produced something that the mages had not specified in any design brief: a class of human beings who existed permanently outside the categories that human society used to define belonging. The Witchers were not quite human. They were not monsters. They were not mages. They had no religion that claimed them, no nation that recognized them, no family structure that could accommodate what they were. They were a solution to a problem, and like most solutions, they had not been designed with the question of their own welfare in mind. The trial of the grasses, the foundational mutation process, killed most of the children who underwent it. This is one of those facts that sits in the history with a particular weight that is hard to describe without either minimizing it or making it melodramatic, neither of which serves it. Children were taken, in the early period, taken involuntarily, before the practice shifted toward a model in which families voluntarily gave up children who were considered burdens, which is a slightly different ethical horror, and subjected to a series of mutagenic preparations that their bodies either adapted to or did not. Most did not. Those who survived were changed. Their eyes became slitted, cat-like, adapted for low-light environments. Their reflexes accelerated beyond normal human capacity. Their sense of smell became capable of identifying species, emotional states, diseases, the presence of magic, and their capacity for certain emotional responses was suppressed, not eliminated despite what the folk myth claimed, but altered in ways that made the full range of human emotional experience less immediately available. The Witchers did not stop feeling. They felt differently, more slowly, with greater effort and greater depth. Geralt of Rivia felt more than most. This is, in itself, a kind of story, that the man who had been most thoroughly altered by additional mutations beyond the standard process, the man whose hair turned white with the intensity of what his body absorbed, emerged as not the least human of the Witchers, but perhaps the most. Vesemir, who trained him, was never quite sure what to make of this. The mutations were supposed to produce weapons. Geralt produced something that kept asking inconvenient questions. The inconvenient questions were mostly about the nature of monstrousness. On the road, which was where Geralt spent the majority of his very long life, the road between one contract and the next, through the borderlands and the forests and the mountain passes where ordinary people did not travel if they could help it, he encountered the full spectrum of what the word monster could contain. There were creatures that killed because they were predators, as indifferent to the ethics of killing as a hawk is indifferent to the ethics of hunting mice. There were creatures that killed because they were in pain, or because they were afraid, or because they had been made into something monstrous by human action and had no other option. And there were humans who were monstrous in ways that no amount of silver could address, the greater evil. This is the principle by which Geralt tried to navigate a world that rarely offered clean choices. Not good versus evil. That binary was available mostly in stories, and Geralt had been in enough real situations to know that stories lie. But lesser evil versus greater evil, which was a calculation that could sometimes be made on the basis of available evidence, Even if the evidence was always incomplete and the calculation never entirely reliable, it is worth pausing here gently, not to solve anything. There is nothing to solve. Just to sit with the image of a man who was made as a tool and refused, with quiet persistence, to be only a tool. Not loudly, not heroically, just persistently. He kept asking the question. He kept choosing, even when the choice was difficult and the consequences were uncertain. This is, in the end, what the Witcher mutations could not suppress. The need to choose, which is perhaps the most definitively human thing there is. Kaer Morhen, the fortress where the Witchers trained and returned between contracts, holds the memory of what was lost when the Witcher schools were attacked. The massacre at Kaer Morhen, carried out by a mob convinced that the Witchers were monsters in the wrong sense of the word, the kind that should not exist, effectively ended the production of new Witchers. After that, the only Witchers were the ones who had survived, and they were already old by the standards of a profession that had always killed young. They aged slowly, as the mutation suppressed whatever mechanism the body uses to wear itself out. But they did not age infinitely. They died on the road, in contracts, in the 1,000 ways that the continent's dark geography provided for ending things that had grown inconvenient. Lambert and Eskel and Vesemir and Geralt, the small family that winters at Kaer Morhen, are the remnant of something that was never meant to be a family and became one anyway. Vesemir especially, who is old enough that his mutation slowed aging, has had time to produce something that resembles what age looks like in an ordinary person. Weathered, careful, possessed of a particular patience that is not resignation but experience. He has outlived the world that made him. He is surviving in a world that does not know what to do with him. Ciri is brought to Kaer Morhen not to be made into a Witcher. She is not going through the trials, but to be trained in the physical capabilities that will allow her to survive what is coming for her. What she receives, in addition to the combat training, is something the Kaer Morhen contingent had not been planning to offer. A family. A rough, winter-cold, emotionally inarticulate family of damaged men who did not fully know how to love someone and loved her anyway. This is the Witcher School's final, unplanned contribution to the history of the continent. Not a weapon, not a tool, but a haven. For one child, for a brief and important time. Let this thought accompany you into the quiet. The people who made the Witchers wanted weapons. The weapons went off script and became something else. This is one of the only genuinely hopeful patterns in the history of the Conjunction's consequences. The capacity of the things that were made for violence to choose, over and over again, something other than violence, not always, not without cost, but often enough, and at enough crucial moments to mean something. Rest now. The mutations are done. The trials are over. The Witcher is on the road, which is the only place he has ever entirely belonged, and the road tonight is quiet and cold and goes on long past the edge of what the eye can see. The Witcher schools that exist alongside the school of the wolf, the bear, the griffin, the viper, the cat, each developed their own mutation protocols, their own training philosophies, their own particular relationship to the question of what a Witcher is for. The differences between them are not trivial. The school of the cat, for instance, produced Witchers whose mutation emphasis was on agility and speed at the expense of the emotional suppression that other schools balanced differently, the result being Witchers who were faster but less stable, more capable of the explosive combat sequence, and less capable of the patient moral reasoning that made Wolf School Witchers useful in complex situations. The Cat School Witchers are, in the folk reputation, the dangerous ones, the ones you call when you need something dead and do not have time for ethical deliberation. This reputation is not entirely fair, but it is not entirely wrong. Vesemir's relationship to his own history as a Witcher is the relationship of a man who has watched everything he built be destroyed and has chosen, without drama, to continue anyway. He was young once. All Witchers were young once. Though the mutations mean that young and Witcher coexisted for only a brief window before the physical aging slowed and the experience began to accumulate in ways that make the word young feel increasingly inadequate. He remembers the Kaer Morhen before the attack. He remembers the training halls full of students who were being made into something the world needed and who would mostly not survive the making. He has been carrying these memories for so long that they have become structural rather than emotional, the way old injuries become structural, defining the shape of movement without announcing themselves as pain. The winter at Kaer Morhen is the closest thing in the Witcher world to a sacred space, not in the religious sense, but in the sense of a place where the ordinary rules of the world outside do not fully apply. The witches who return there are not performing the social roles they occupy on the road. They are not contracts or swords or the answer to a village's problem. They are simply themselves, damaged, capable, fond of each other, in the way that people who have survived things together are fond of each other, without requiring the articulation of fondness. The Kaer Morhen winter is long and cold and quiet. The witches train when training is called for and sit in silence when silence is called for, and tell stories to each other in the evenings that grow longer and longer as the months progress. The stories are true. They are also, in some sense, the medium through which the witches process what they have experienced. The contracts, the choices, the things they could not prevent and the things they chose not to prevent and the things that were done before they arrived. Lambert is the witcher who most openly carries his anger at what was done to him. He did not volunteer for the trials. Few witches of his generation did. By the time he was brought to Kaer Morhen, the practice had shifted towards something more like opportunistic recruitment of children from desperate circumstances, which is a euphemism for exploitation that the institution had not quite finished admitting to itself. Lambert knows what he is. He knows what was taken from him to make him what he is. And he has developed, in place of the grief that would be too much to carry, a particular brand of acerbic humour that allows him to say true things at angles that do not require him to be direct about how much they hurt. Geralt's relationship to the question of what was done to him is more complicated than Lambert's, which is to say, it is more buried, which is to say, it is deeper. He has spent enough decades with himself to have made some peace with what he is, not the forced peace of someone who gave up, but the earned peace of someone who kept asking the question, and eventually arrived at a working relationship with the answer. What he is a weapon that chose to have opinions. What the opinions cost him, in a world that would prefer its weapons not to have opinions, is almost everything. And he keeps paying the cost, which is the particular stubbornness that defines him above all else. The monsters that witches kill are not, in the final accounting, the real subject of the Witcher saga. They are the surface. The real subject is what the conjunction of the spheres did to the concept of belonging, how it created a world in which everything was displaced and nothing quite fit, and how the creatures and peoples of that world navigated the displacement across the centuries. The Witchers are the most complete expression of this theme, created specifically for the displaced world, constitutionally incapable of belonging to any of its categories, and yet finding, in the in-between spaces that their displacement produces, something that functions like home. Ciri will understand this when she finally stops running, not because she will find a place that definitively belongs to her in the way that Sintra belonged to her before the fall. The world does not offer that anymore, for her. What she will find is something smaller and more sustainable. The recognition that belonging is not a place, it is a practice. It is the choice, made repeatedly, to be present with the people who are present with you. It is Geralt on the road, and Yennefer with her impossible standards, and Vesemir in the cold hall of Kaer Morhen. It is smaller than what she lost. It is also, in certain lights, enough. Somewhere in the deep genealogy of the Cintran royal line, a secret was hidden so carefully that it took 1,000 years for anyone to realize it was not a secret at all. It was a key. Somewhere in the deep genealogy of the Cintran royal line, a secret was hidden so carefully that it took 1,000 years for anyone to realize it was not a secret at all. It was a key. The elder blood of the En Severn, the knowing ones among the NL, the elves of another sphere, did not arrive in Ciri by accident. It was planted. It was cultivated across generations. And the girl who carried it had no idea for most of her childhood that her bloodline was the most consequential thing about her in anyone's eyes but her grandmother's. Breathe in slowly. Hold for a moment, not in tension, just in the pause that exists between one breath and the next, where all the day's noise falls away, and then release. That pause is what we are resting in tonight, the space between cause and consequence, between the planting of a seed and the blooming of a thing no one entirely expected. Ciri is that bloom, angry, frightened, powerful, compassionate, catastrophic. She is the conclusion of a plan set in motion before her grandmother was born. The Lara Dorren story begins in the age of elven-human contact, the period after the initial shock of the conjunction had settled. but before the wars of displacement had fully calcified into the patterns of hatred and suspicion that would define later centuries. It was still possible, in this period, for an elven mage named Lara Doran to love a human mage named Crigenan of Lod. Not without complication, not without the disapproval of both their peoples, who were already developing the mutual mistrust that would later harden into organised violence. But possible. Lara Doran was En Severn. This is the detail that matters most, and that is most easy to pass over because it requires unpacking. The En Severn were not simply elves with an unusual gift. They were the keepers of a specific magical inheritance, the gene that the Elder Blood activates, which had been cultivated among the elven people of the Other Sphere, the NL, over countless generations. This gene allowed its carrier to manipulate space and time, to move between worlds, to sense and navigate the flows of destiny in ways that other mages could only approximate through scholarship and second-hand knowledge. When Lara Doran and Crigenan produced a child, that child carried the Elder Blood in a form it had never existed in before, mixed with human genetic material. The hybrid was unexpected. Its properties were unknown. The elven scholars who understood what the En Severn bloodline was supposed to do could not predict what it would do filtered through a human body with a human relationship to time, mortality, and the specific kind of urgency that comes from knowing you will die in decades rather than centuries. What it did, as far as anyone can tell from the fragmentary evidence, was amplify. The Elder Blood in a full elven carrier was powerful. In the hybrid line that descended from Lara Doran's child, passed down through the Cintran royal house, across a dozen generations, it became something else. More volatile, more reactive, capable of accessing the space-time manipulation at a more fundamental level than the original bloodline. The NL recognized this. It was why they needed Ciri. It was why Eredin rode the wild hunt across the frozen spaces between worlds in her pursuit. Not because she was the last of the En Severn bloodline, because she was potentially the most powerful iteration of it that had ever existed. Ciri did not know any of this when she was growing up in Cintra. She knew her grandmother Calanthe, Queen of Cintra, the Lioness, a woman who commanded rooms by existing in them. She knew the sound of the sea and the smell of salt, and the particular quality of the light in the palace courtyard in late afternoon. She knew the stories her nursemaids told and the lessons her tutors gave, and the loneliness that is native to children of powerful people who must be kept at a careful distance from ordinary friendship. She did not know that she was a key. She did not know that the world's most dangerous factions were measuring her potential before she could read. The fall of Cintra, when Nilfgaard's forces broke through the kingdom's defences and the Lioness chose to die rather than surrender, changed Ciri from a princess with an unusual destiny into a refugee with nothing but that destiny. It is one of the cruelest inflections in the story. The very moment her protection was stripped away was the moment she needed it most, because her power was emerging with the unpredictability of something that has been suppressed and then suddenly encounters the pressure of genuine fear. She ran. She ran through forests that should have killed her and did not, through circumstances that should have ended her and did not, through encounters that should have broken her and did not quite. This is not magic exactly, or not only magic. It is also the particular resilience of a person who has decided, at a level below conscious thought, that they are going to survive. Ciri decided this very early and maintained it through conditions that would have broken the decision in almost anyone else. It is worth sitting with this very quietly. The Elder Blood responds to emotion, to need, to fear, to the specific desperation of a person who has run out of options. When Ciri's power activated for the first time in any meaningful way, it was not in a controlled environment under the supervision of a mentor. It was in the middle of a crisis. It was a wound expressing itself as a gift, which is perhaps the most Witcher world thing about it. The distinction between those two categories has never been particularly clean. Geralt's claim on Ciri, the law of surprise, the oldest binding in the world's tradition, the claim on something you do not yet know you have, was not initially understood by either of them as what it was. He thought it was an awkward obligation. She thought he was a means of escape from wherever she happened to be. The relationship that developed between them had no template, because neither of them had access to the kind of ordinary family that the template is built from. What they built instead was something improvised and specific to themselves, which is the only kind of love that persists. Yennefer understood Ciri differently than Geralt did. Where Geralt saw a child who needed protection and training, Yennefer saw a child who needed to be allowed to become what she was going to become, which required protection and training but also something less comfortable. The insistence that the child's own sense of herself was worth more than anyone's plan for her. This is perhaps the most important thing Yennefer ever did, and it is not the kind of thing that appears in any chronicle of her accomplishments as a mage. The kings and the mages and the elven kings and the Imperial Intelligence Services all wanted Ciri for what her blood contained. The three people who actually loved her, Geralt, Yennefer, and in her own complicated way her grandmother before her death, wanted her for herself. This distinction is the moral spine of the entire narrative. Everything else is politics. This is the part that matters. The Elder Blood will carry Ciri through spaces that no other person could navigate, through the worlds of the Anel, through the frozen corridors where the Wild Hunt rides, through versions of time and possibility that most people never perceive. It will make her the most important person in the history of the continent. It will also, repeatedly, come close to destroying her, because the price of being a nexus through which the world's largest forces flow is that those forces have no particular interest in the vessel's welfare. She survives because she chooses to, because she has, somewhere in the turbulence of the Elder Blood and the grief of losing Sintra, and the complicated education of Kaer Morhen Winters, and Yennefer's exacting expectations, developed a self that is coherent enough to choose. This is the thing the Anella did not account for in their breeding program. They created a vessel for the Elder Blood. They did not account for the possibility that the vessel would have opinions. Rest now. Ciri is running somewhere in the story's vast geography. She's always running, always moving, always carrying more than anyone asked her to carry. But she's not running from herself. She found herself somewhere along the road, and she held on. That is the quiet miracle at the centre of this story. Not the Elder Blood, not the destiny, just a girl who found herself and held on. The world will have many claims on her. Tonight, in the dark, with the quiet settled around you, she belongs to no one's plan. She's simply running, and the wind that follows her smells of old magic and salt and the first green edge of spring. The law of surprise is the oldest tradition in the Witcher world. Older than the kingdoms, older than the mages, older than the organised memory of anything but the very deep forest traditions and the Ain Seder, oral histories that predate writing on this continent. It is the claim on something unexpected, the thing a person finds waiting for them when they return home that they didn't have when they left. A harvest, a letter, a child born in their absence. The law does not specify what the surprise will be. It only specifies the structure. Whoever saves a life may claim, in exchange, the unexpected. And whatever the unexpected turns out to be, that thing, that relationship, that circumstance, is bound to the claimant by something deeper than contract, by something the world itself enforces. The philosophers of the continent have argued about the law of surprise for as long as they have been arguing about anything. Is it magic? Is it fate? Is it a social custom that acquired the patina of inevitability through repetition? Is it a meaningful force or an elaborate coincidence machine that people retrospectively assign meaning to because the alternative, that these convergences are random, is too unsatisfying to accept? Geralt, who does not believe in destiny, and whose life is its strongest argument, would probably agree with the last option. The evidence would probably disagree with him. Pavetta's story, the Princess of Sintra, whose betrothal feast produced the encounter through which Geralt first invoked the law of surprise on her behalf, is not a simple love story, though love is present in it. It is a story about the collision between what parents plan for their children and what the children's own natures require. Pavetta had inherited the Elder Blood's latent manifestation in a form she could not control, a powerful, unpredictable magical gift that emerged under emotional pressure and was capable of levelling stone. Calanthe had hidden this, managed it, kept it out of the discourse of the court with the particular competence of a woman who had kept secrets before. What she could not hide was the bond that had formed between Pavetta and the Knight Urkion, the Hedgehog Knight, cursed and seeking the end of his curse through love freely given. The feast was Calanthe's last attempt to contain the situation through conventional political means, a gathering of suitors, a controlled environment, The authority of the Queen brought to bear on a problem she had defined as manageable. What she had not accounted for was that the elder blood does not respond to conventional political means. When Ursian was threatened, when Pavetta's emotional state reached the threshold the gift required, the magic came out, not violently, but irresistibly, the way water comes out of a vessel that has been filled past its capacity. The ceiling of the banquet hall was the first casualty. The Queen's composure was the second. Geralt's intervention in that moment was not calculated. He did not see the elder blood and move to position himself. He saw a situation that was about to become catastrophic, and responded with the combination of practical capability and ethical stubbornness that is his characteristic mode. He invoked the law of surprise not because he wanted a child. He did not at that moment want anything so specific, but because it was the formula available to him, and the formula seemed in the moment to match the gravity of what he had done. Something for something, a life for a life. The world owed him a surprise, and the world, he discovered later, had been holding one in reserve for a very long time. The surprise was Ciri. She did not exist yet when the law was invoked. She was not yet born when Geralt rode away from Cintra that night, uneasy with the claim he had made, and more uneasy with the sense that the claim was somehow returning something that had already been sent to find him. She was born, grew, learned to run and ride and read, lost her parents in a shipwreck that the elder blood did not prevent, and which no destiny had written into anyone's plan as a requirement. And then the world Calanthe had built to keep her safe ended, and the claim came due, and the man who had invoked the law of surprise on a winter's night in a Cintran banquet hall became, by the stranger mathematics of fate, her father. He did not feel like a father. He had never had a template for the role. He had been taken from his own mother and made into a weapon. Fatherhood was not part of the design specifications. What he felt, meeting Ciri for the first time in the forest, while the world she had known was ending behind her, was something closer to recognition. The specific recognition of someone who has been looking for something without knowing they were looking and has suddenly found it. He did not name this feeling. He was not, in general, a man who named feelings. He simply took her with him, which was all the naming required. The Wild Hunt is not a legend. It is not a folk horror passed down by people who needed an explanation for the cold. It is a cavalry unit from another dimension, riding enslaved human souls as mounts through the frozen spaces between worlds. Ask yourself, which version of that is more frightening? The Wild Hunt is not a legend. It is not a folk horror passed down by frightened people who needed an explanation for the cold and the dark of deep winter. It is a cavalry unit from another dimension, riding enslaved human souls as mounts through the frozen spaces between worlds. Ask yourself, in the quiet of tonight, which version of that is more frightening? The legend or the truth? Let your body be still now. Not rigid. The stillness of something that has settled, not something bracing for impact. The Wild Hunt has been riding these spaces between worlds for longer than the conjunction has existed, and it has never yet arrived for someone who is simply resting. What it comes for is different. What it comes for is specific. And understanding what it comes for requires understanding where it comes from. The NLA are elves. That is the simple version, and like most simple versions, it is accurate but insufficient. They are the elves who did not cross from whatever original sphere the elven peoples shared into the world that would become the continent. They are the ones who stayed, or who were left, or who chose a different path depending on which source you consult and how much you trust the parties whose versions you are reading. They live in a world of their own, vast and strange and beautiful, with cities that extend across geography that would encompass several continents laid end to end. Tia-Nalia, the capital of the NLA, is the kind of place that makes the most magnificent human cities look like provincial market towns. Not in an unkind way, not as a statement of contempt, though Eredin's contempt for humanity is comprehensive, but in the simple factual sense that it was built by people with centuries of uninterrupted time to build it, without the interruptions of war and plague and political instability that have kept human architecture humble. The NL had time. They used it. Their world shows the accumulation of that time in every stone and every garden and every silence between structures. But the NL have a problem. Their world is dying. Not spectacularly. Not in the manner of an explosion or a flood or any of the dramatic endings that catastrophe usually wears. It is dying slowly, the way things die when the engine that sustains them runs out of whatever it was running on. The population of the NLE is declining. The birth rate has fallen below replacement. The magic that animates their world is thinning, the way a fire thins toward the end of the fuel it was given. They are a civilization in the late chapter of a story that does not have a sequel. This is the context for everything Eredin does. His obsession with the Elder Blood, his pursuit of Ciri across worlds, the Wild Hunt's centuries of raiding through the dimensional corridors for human slaves, all of it proceeds from a civilization that is watching itself end, and is willing to do almost anything to prevent that ending. Eredin is not a cartoonish villain. He is a military commander who believes, with the cold conviction of a man who has watched his world shrink for his entire very long life, that the ends justify the means. The means in this case are monstrous, but the ends, the survival of his people, are comprehensible. The dimensional corridors that the Wild Hunt rides are not roads. They are the spaces between worlds, the same spaces that opened during the conjunction of the spheres, though in a more controlled form. The NLA discovered, long before the conjunction, that these spaces could be navigated by those with the right magical capabilities. What they learned about the conjunction, in retrospect, was that it was a catastrophic version of the kind of dimensional transit they had been performing deliberately for millennia. The wound that broke the continent's world was a wild, uncontrolled version of something the NLA had been doing carefully, to a much smaller degree, for as long as they had been a civilization. The Wild Hunt's riders appear in the folklore of almost every culture on the continent. Red-cloaked figures on ghost horses in the winter sky, bad omens, the sign that someone you love is about to be taken. The folk accounts are not entirely wrong about the phenomenology. They are describing something real that people really saw. But they are working with a conceptual framework that cannot accommodate what the Wild Hunt actually is. The folk mind reaches for what it knows: spectral riders, demonic cavalry, the punishment of gods who have grown impatient. What it cannot reach for is the truth, which is that the figure at the head of that cavalcade is a frustrated military commander from a dying civilization, riding enslaved souls through frozen dimensional corridors in pursuit of a specific young woman whose DNA contains the solution to his world's extinction. The enslaved souls deserve more attention than they typically receive in the main narrative. The spectral riders who make up the bulk of the Hunt's cavalry, the ones who look like ghosts and move like smoke and carry the cold with them wherever they go, were once people. Human people mostly, taken from the continent over centuries of Wild Hunt raids. They were not killed and enslaved in the conventional sense. They were removed from their worlds and their bodies and their lives and converted into something that the NLA's dimensional travel required, which is an act of violence so complete that it eradicates the distinction between murder and something worse. Geralt spent time as a spectral rider. This is the fact about his history that most fundamentally colours his response to the Wild Hunt, not just as an enemy, but as a specific kind of wrong that he has experienced from the inside. He remembers almost none of it. The process of becoming a spectral rider and returning from that state leaves gaps in the memory that may be structural or may be merciful, and it is not always clear which. What he carries is not the memory but the residue, a specific quality of cold that he feels when the hunt is near, that is different from ordinary cold the way a scar is different from uninjured skin. It is worth pausing here, in the night, and considering what the Wild Hunt means as a symbol in the context of the Witcher world's history. It is the conjunction's consequence made cavalry. It is the consequence of multiple civilizations running out of room, the NL running out of future, the continent running out of space, the dimensional corridors becoming the contested territory of competing needs. The Wild Hunt is what happens when need is powerful enough, and moral scruple is insufficient to contain it. Avallac'h is the most complicated figure in this part of the story. He is NL, which means he is, in a structural sense, an ally of Eredin's agenda, the survival of his people, but he is also, in a more personal and harder to categorize sense, Ciri's ally, or at least her reluctant steward. He is the one who has been most thoroughly thinking through what the Elder Blood means across the full span of history, and what he has concluded is that the NLA's plan to use Ciri as a dimensional key to escape their dying world is more complicated than Eredin understands. If the dark feels a little deeper now, if the history has carried you somewhere quiet, let it. You are exactly where you are meant to be. Subscribe so the next story finds you when you are ready. Sleep on, Ciri, when she eventually spends time among the NLA, encounters a world that should be alien to her and finds it partially familiar. The Elder Blood recognizes something in it, or the NLO world recognizes something in the Elder Blood. The resonance is uncomfortable, the way a musical note is uncomfortable when it is almost but not quite the one the instrument was tuned to produce. She does not belong among the NL, but she's also not entirely other to them. She is once again the impossible synthesis, the child who carries the wound of the conjunction in her blood, and who is simultaneously the most human person in any room she enters, and the heir to something vastly older than humanity. The Wild Hunt will eventually be broken. The story does not end with eternal riders in the frozen corridors between worlds, but what replaces the hunt is not resolution. It is aftermath. The NL will still be dying. The dimensional corridors will still exist. The wound of the conjunction will still be there. What changes is who has the power to do something about it, and what they choose to do with that power when it arrives. Rest now. The riders are far from here tonight. The sky above you is your sky. The ordinary sky of a world that has had its centuries of catastrophe and is for now quiet. Let the cold of the hunt's memory dissolve in the warmth of whatever is around you. The history between worlds is vast and cold and full of the echo of hoofbeats, but the hoofbeats are fading. They are always eventually fading. The dimensional corridors that the Wild Hunt navigates are not the only such passages through the spaces between worlds. They are simply the most visibly terrifying ones because they are occupied by spectral cavalry riding enslaved souls through frozen darkness. The elves of both the Unsada and the NLA traditions knew of these corridors long before the conjunction formally opened the larger breach that brought everything else through. The art of navigating them, called the Elven Gate in most traditions, though it has no clean name that translates across the languages involved, was closely guarded, passed down through the Ensevern bloodline as both a practical capability and a profound spiritual responsibility. Avalak's understanding of the corridors is the most complete among the characters we encounter in the main narrative. He has spent centuries, possibly millennia, mapping them, not in the cartographic sense, because the corridors do not have the stable geography that cartography requires, but in the sense of developing an intuitive understanding of how they behave, what they respond to, what destabilizes them. He knows that the Elder Blood creates a kind of navigational attunement that ordinary mages, however powerful, cannot replicate. A mage like Yennefer can tear open a portal through brute force. She does not navigate the corridor so much as bulldoze through it. The Elder Blood does something different. It moves with the corridor's own topology, the way a fish moves with a current, and arrives at the destination with the energy intact. When Ciri first uses this ability, in the desperate flight from Sintra's fall, through a series of dislocations that she experiences as near drowning, and which leave her scattered across geography in ways she cannot afterwards fully account for, she is not controlling it. The Elder Blood is doing what it does when sufficiently stressed, finding the path of least dimensional resistance, which is not always the path of least physical resistance. She arrives where the corridor takes her, which is not always where she intended to go. This is the difference between having power and having mastery. The power is hers by blood. The mastery she has to build, slowly, with Avalaka's reluctant instruction, and her own ferocious stubbornness, over years of practice she did not ask for. The ghost of the soldiers who ride with Eredin deserve more than a footnote, and yet the narrative structure of the Wild Hunt tends to push them into the margins. They are atmosphere, they are threat, they are the visual horror of the hunt before Eredin himself becomes visible. What they were is worth remembering. People, human people, mostly, taken from their lives on the continent over the course of many generations of Wild Hunt raids. The raids were conducted with cold, strategic purpose. The hunt needed the enslaved souls to navigate the corridors at scale, because the Anela's own magical resources were diminishing as their world died, and they could no longer sustain large-scale interdimensional travel on their own power alone. The humans provided the energy. The humans had not agreed to provide the energy. Geralt's particular anger at the Wild Hunt, colder and quieter than his anger at most things, which is one marker of how seriously he takes it, is rooted in this understanding. He has been inside the process. He knows what it takes. He knows that the men who ride in that eternal cold are not monsters who chose monstrousness. They are people who were taken from their places and their people and their particular warm versions of ordinary life, and who are now serving a purpose that no one asked their permission for. His determination to defeat Eredin is not primarily strategic. It is personal in the way that only things you have survived from the inside can be personal. The cold that the Wild Hunt carries wherever it rides is not metaphorical. It is a physical property of the dimensional corridors, the frozen spaces between worlds, where the temperature is the temperature of the void itself, which is the temperature of a universe that has not yet concentrated enough energy in any one place to produce warmth. When the hunt crosses into the continent's atmosphere, it brings this void cold with it. Crops die, rivers freeze, animals flee in the patterns of things that recognize, at the deepest instinctive level, that what is coming is not a predator, but something much more fundamental, the cold at the heart of the universe, briefly made local. Ciri will learn to move through those corridors without becoming them. This is perhaps the most impressive thing she learns, and the one least acknowledged. Not the combat capability, not the tactical flexibility, not even the Elder Blood's spatial manipulation. The most impressive thing is that she can pass through the void between worlds and come back warm. She carries, through all the cold, the specific warmth of someone who has decided that the universe's temperature is not her problem, and that she is going to be warm in spite of it. This is not magic. This is character. And in the Witcher world, character turns out to be the one force that the void cannot absorb. If the dark feels a little deeper now, if the history has carried you somewhere quiet, let it. You are exactly where you are meant to be. Subscribe so the next story finds you when you are ready. Sleep on. The White Frost is not a weapon. It is not a curse. It is not the revenge of a god or the consequence of a single catastrophic act. It is simply what happens at the end. Every world, every sphere, every reality, all of them eventually reaches the same destination. Ithlin's prophecy did not predict a catastrophe. It predicted arithmetic. The White Frost is not a weapon. It is not a curse. It is not the revenge of a god or the consequence of a single catastrophic act. It is simply what happens at the end. Every world, every sphere, every reality that has ever existed, all of them eventually, according to the prophecy and the cosmological knowledge of those who have travelled between worlds, reaches the same destination: the cold, the silence, the slow, inevitable extinction of warmth from a universe that has run out of the energy that sustains it. Ithlin's prophecy did not predict a catastrophe. It predicted arithmetic. Let that settle over you like the particular weight of deep winter. Not the sharp cold of an early frost, but the bone-deep cold of a winter that has gone on so long you have stopped expecting warmth to return. This is the cold that lives at the back of the Witcher world's cosmology. Not dramatic, not sudden. Just the slow certainty of a universe moving toward its own conclusion, and the terrifying question of what, if anything, can be done about it. Ithlin was an elven prophet. This is what the records say, when they say anything at all. The records are thin, as records tend to be when the subject matter is several thousand years old, and the civilization that produced the primary sources has been substantially demolished in the interim. What survives of her prophecy exists in fragments, in partial translations, in the elven oral tradition that humans have found ways to dismiss as superstition, in the same motion they use to avoid being frightened by it. The prophecy speaks of the coming of the cold, the White Frost, as the inevitable terminus of the cycle of spheres that the conjunction set in motion. The most important word in that prophecy, and the one most frequently elided in the scholarly discussions that take it seriously at all, is the Elder Blood. The prophecy does not simply announce that the White Frost is coming. It announces that the Elder Blood will carry a child of destiny across the spaces between worlds, through the frost, ahead of the frost, to some as yet unrealized destination that the prophecy describes in metaphors so layered that 3,000 years of elven scholarship have not definitively unpacked them. The frost is not the end of the prophecy. It is the obstacle within it. Gales understood this, in the way that Ain Elle scholars understand things, completely, in the abstract, with all the formal precision of a people who have had millennia to develop their theoretical frameworks, and with the particular emotional distance of someone who has spent so long understanding something catastrophic that the understanding has replaced the feeling. He knew the White Frost was coming for the NLE's world. He knew it was coming for the continent. He knew it was coming for every sphere in time, and that the time varied but the conclusion did not. He filed this knowledge in the part of his mind reserved for things that are true, and which there is nothing to be done about, except that Avalach believed there was something to be done about it. This is the great division between the two NLA thinkers who matter most to Ciri's story. Gilles accepted the White Frost as an endpoint and focused on maximizing the quality of existence before that endpoint arrived. Avalach believed that the Elder Blood, specifically Ciri's version of it, the amplified hybrid form that had emerged from the Lara Dorren bloodline, might be capable of doing something the prophecy hinted at but did not specify, not preventing the frost, but finding a way through it, a way to something on the other side. This is not hope exactly. It does not carry the lightness that the word hope usually implies. It is more like a hypothesis formed by a scientist who has ruled out every other possibility and is left with one remaining option that he cannot prove but also cannot disprove. Avalach's investment in Ciri is not sentimental, it is methodological. She is the most powerful iteration of the Elder Blood that has ever existed. If anyone can do what the prophecy suggests might be doable, it is her. He protects her with this knowledge in mind, not because he loves her, though something that functions like affection develops over time, but because she is irreplaceable. Ciri herself, when she eventually learns enough to understand what is being asked of her, does not respond with the resigned acceptance that Avalach had perhaps anticipated. She is not a tool. She has established this about herself, at considerable cost, over the course of a life that began as someone else's prophecy and has been fought every step of the way toward being her own. When she is confronted with the White Frost, when she is placed through the convergence of the story's enormous forces in a position to act on the prophecy, what she does is choose. Not the choice Avalach specified, not the choice Eredin would have forced, her own choice. We should sit with the nature of the White Frost itself for a moment, not as a plot device, as a cosmological phenomenon. If the conjunction of the spheres was the moment all the worlds touched, the White Frost is the direction that the universe moves in afterward. The touching, the collision and exchange, generates heat, entropy, the disorganization of energy that slowly, over vast spans of time, becomes the cold at the end of everything. The conjunction was not just the source of the Witcher world's monsters. It was, in a very long-view sense, the beginning of the countdown to the White Frost. Every world that was touched by the conjunction was drawn into a process that ends the same way. The Dryads of Brokilon, who are ancient and who know things that they do not always articulate in forms that humans can pass, have a word for the White Frost that does not translate cleanly into any of the continent's languages. It is the closest thing in their vocabulary to the word that means both silence and completion simultaneously. Not silence as an absence of sound, as a presence of something that has finished becoming what it was going to be. The Brokilon Dryads are not particularly disturbed by the prospect of the White Frost in the way that Avalach is disturbed by it. They are old enough to understand endings as part of the shape of things. Geralt does not think about the White Frost often. He is, constitutionally, a man of the immediate. The contract in front of him, the road under his boots, the decision that needs to be made before the thing with claws makes it for him. The long view, the cosmological view, the view from which the White Frost is relevant, is not his natural register. But when Ciri is in danger from forces connected to the prophecy, when the Wild Hunt rides, when the stakes expand beyond any individual contract, he accesses something that is not the long view exactly, but is also not purely the immediate, the sense that what is happening matters in a way that transcends the particular moment, that the person he's protecting is not just a person, but something the world needs to remain possible. This is what it means to be the child of destiny. The people who love you are protecting not just you, but the world's ability to have a future. This is an enormous weight to place on a teenage girl. It is placed on her regardless, because the world is not in the habit of distributing weight equitably. What Geralt and Yennefer provide in the midst of this weight is the reminder that she is also a person, that the prophecy does not define her, that she's allowed to want things for herself that have nothing to do with what the universe has decided it needs from her bloodline. The stars that the Witcher world looks up at are the same stars that will one day be cold. The forests that the elves mourn are lit by the same light that the White Frost will eventually extinguish. The magic that runs through the ley lines draws on the same dimensional energy that is, in the very long view, winding down. This world, like all the worlds that touched each other during the conjunction, is temporary. It has always been temporary. The conjunction did not create this fact. It simply began the countdown, and yet. Within the temporary, things matter. The choice Ciri makes when she confronts the White Frost matters, not because it saves the universe from its ultimate fate, but because it determines what the universe does in the time it has remaining. The difference between a world that burns a little longer and a world that goes cold a little sooner is, from the cosmic perspective, trivial. From the perspective of every person who will live and die and love within that additional time, it is everything. Rest now. The White Frost is still far from here, not just in space but in time, in the vast accumulation of time that has not yet happened. The warmth around you is real. It is present. It is the warmth of a world that is still happening. Let it hold you. The cold at the end of everything does not arrive tonight. Tonight there is only the dark and the quiet and the breathing that continues without effort, the body doing what it was made to do, warm and slow and entirely sufficient for the moment. Ithlin's prophecy survives in fragments across multiple sources, partial transcriptions in human chronicles that were produced from second- and third-hand accounts, and cedar oral versions that were transmitted across generations with the careful fidelity that long-lived peoples develop for things they consider important, and one apparently complete version in an NLA archive that Ciri encountered without being able to read it in full, because the script was an archaic form of elder speech she had not yet mastered at that point in her education. The fragments that do survive agree on the broad strokes. The White Frost is coming, the Elder Blood will be the key, and the consequence of getting this wrong is the end of everything. What the prophecy does not specify, and what Avalach's centuries of study have not been able to determine from the fragments he has access to, is what getting it right looks like. The prophecy is extraordinarily precise about the threat, and extraordinarily vague about the solution. This is, as any scholar of prophetic literature can tell you, characteristic of the form. Prophecies describe what will happen if nothing intervenes, and gesture toward the general shape of the intervention required, while declining to provide the specific steps. Whether this is because prophecy is a description of fate rather than a prescription for action, or because the prophet could see the danger but not the path through it, or because the path through it cannot be specified in advance because it depends on choices that have not yet been made. These are questions that Avalach has been asking himself for longer than most human civilizations have existed, without arriving at a satisfying answer. The conjunction's relationship to the White Frost is the detail that most troubles the deepest scholars of dimensional cosmology. If the conjunction was the moment multiple spheres touched, and if the White Frost is the entropic consequence of that touching, then the conjunction was not simply a disaster, it was the beginning of an ending. Every world that was breached by the conjunction is now on a timeline that leads eventually to the same cold conclusion. This is not a comforting thought. It is also not an actionable one in the short term. The timeline is long enough that no single generation has to live with the immediacy of it. But it changes the meaning of everything that has happened since. The wars, the kingdoms, the mages and their institutions, the witches and their contracts. All of it is happening inside a ticking universe, on a world that has an appointment with the cold it does not know how to cancel. The dwarves of Mahakam have a phrase, spoken rarely and only in circumstances of sufficient gravity, that translates roughly as, "The mountain will outlast the argument." It is their characteristic response to disputes that threaten to consume more energy than the subject warrants. Applied to the White Frost, it takes on a different resonance. The mountain will outlast even itself eventually. The stone that seems permanent is only permanent within a time scale that no living thing inhabits. This is not fatalism. The dwarves are not fatalistic. It is a form of proportion, the recognition that the urgent and the important are rarely the same thing, and that the skill of distinguishing between them is the most valuable skill available to any intelligence that must navigate time. Ciri's encounter with the White Frost itself, in the dimensional corridors, at the outer limit of what the Elder Blood can navigate, is the most extraordinary sequence in the saga, and the one about which the least has been said in the official histories. This is because the official histories were written by people who were not there, and who must reconstruct the event from Ciri's own account, which she gives only partially, and with the particular reservation of someone describing an experience that exceeded the available language. What she describes, when she describes it at all, is not terror, it is recognition. The white frost looked, she said, like something she had been moving toward her whole life without knowing it, like the face of the thing that had been waiting for her since before she was born. She did not go to it. She did not let it take her. She turned in the midst of the recognition and came back. Not because the pull wasn't real, but because she had something to come back to, which is the most ancient and reliable reason for returning from anywhere dangerous. She had Geralt. She had Yennefer. She had the specific ordinary warmth of a life that was hers and not the universe's, that belonged to her in a way that the destiny and the prophecy and the elder blood never quite had. The white frost was the universe's claim on her. The people she loved were hers. She chose hers. And in the choosing, in the specific, deliberate, fully conscious act of turning away from the end of everything and returning to the ongoing middle of something, she did what the prophecy had been building toward without managing to specify. She demonstrated that the elder blood could navigate the white frost without being consumed by it. The corridor between the two possibilities remained open. Other worlds, in other times, on other timelines, might find it. What she left behind her, in the void where the frost lived, was the proof that it was possible, not a solution, not a cure, just the proof of a path. That is all prophecy ever actually offers. The rest is up to the people on the path. The most powerful sorceress on the continent was, before Aretusa, a hunchbacked girl from a poor family who was considered less than nothing by the world that made her. The transformation that produced Yennefer did not only change her body, it cost her the one thing she wanted more than power, and she chose it anyway. The most powerful sorceress on the continent was, before Aretusa, a hunchbacked girl from a poor family who was considered less than nothing by the world that made her. This is not a fairy tale about transformation rewarding virtue. This is a story about what transformation actually costs, and how the cost is never fully disclosed until after it is paid, and what it means to spend your entire life trying to come to terms with a bargain you made before you knew what you were bargaining with. Let your body be completely still now. Not the stillness of tension, the deeper stillness of something that has fully released. This segment asks something different from you than the others have. Not just to listen, but to feel the weight of a choice made by a person who had very few choices and chose the most difficult one available. Yennefer's story is not comfortable, but it is honest, and at this hour, in this quiet, honesty is the only thing that actually reaches the part of us that needs to hear it. The girl who arrived at Aretusa was 14 and frightened and carrying herself with the particular rigidity of someone who has learned that every vulnerability will be exploited the moment it is displayed. Her magic was clearly present. The assessment of the Brotherhood's recruiters was unequivocal on this point, but her control was almost non-existent. The chaos energy that manifested when she lost control of her emotions was disproportionate to anything they had seen in a student in some years. Tissaia de Vries, who had made a career of accurate assessments, looked at this girl and saw something that made her pause. What Tissaia saw was not potential in the ordinary sense. Potential was common enough. What she saw was a quality of need that was almost indistinguishable from power. A person who had been denied everything and had developed, in the place where acceptance should have been, a hunger that could metabolize the chaos energy the same way fire metabolizes oxygen. Desperate people make effective mages, because the desperation removes the hesitation that more secure people carry as a buffer between themselves and the forces they are attempting to direct. Yennefer had no hesitation. She had only the need. The training at Aretusa was not kind. It was not designed to be kind. Tissaia did not regard kindness as a relevant variable in the education of mages, which was something Yennefer would not fully understand until she was doing the same thing to her own students decades later. What the training provided was structure for something that had been chaotic, language for something that had been wordless, context for something that had been frightening. Yennefer received all of this and filed it in the same internal space where other people kept warmth, which was already empty, so it fitted well enough. The transformation that came with her fully realized training was physical as well as magical. This is the aspect of the mage's path that is not discussed frankly in most polite accounts of the Brotherhood. The sorcerers who reach the highest levels of capability do not simply learn to control the chaos energy. They allow it to restructure them. The physical transformation that Yennefer underwent was not cosmetic surgery in the mundane sense. It was a fundamental reorganization of her physical form using chaos magic as the operative principle. The hunchback was corrected. The asymmetries of her face were resolved into something that the world would call beautiful, because beauty in this world, as in most worlds, is largely a matter of symmetry and the absence of visible damage. What the transformation cost was the fertility she had not yet had. This is the detail that tends to get mentioned and then set aside in most discussions of Yennefer's history, because it is uncomfortable, and because its implications extend in directions that require a kind of attention most people prefer to avoid. The chaos energy that restructured her body required certain biological processes to be repurposed. The mages who designed the transformation were aware of this cost. They did not, in general, discuss it with the students before it happened, on the theory that the students had already committed to the path and that providing this information in advance would complicate the process without changing the outcome. Yennefer was not given the choice. This is the thing that matters most about this part of her story, and the thing that she has never fully stopped being angry about, even in the years when she has found other things to focus on. She was not asked. The cost was extracted without consent, in the process of a transformation she had nominally agreed to, but whose full terms she had not been shown. This is not the only instance of this pattern in the Brotherhood's history. It is the most intimate one. The anger that this produced in Yennefer is not simply understandable, it is appropriate. It is the correct response to an injustice of that particular kind. What makes Yennefer's relationship to that anger complicated and interesting is that it coexists with her genuine valuation of what the transformation gave her: the power, the beauty, the ability to exist in the world on terms that she chose, rather than terms that were assigned to her by a universe that had decided, without consulting her, that she was not worth very much. She would not trade the transformation. She would not go back to what she was. And she carries the cost of it with a precision that does not permit her to forget it for very long. Her pursuit of a cure, the years she spent investigating the possibility of restoring her fertility through magical means, is not simply a storyline about wanting children. It is a story about the right to choose one's own future, about the difference between a sacrifice you make voluntarily and one that is made on your behalf by people who decided they knew better. She did not need to want children specifically. She needed to be the person who decided whether she did. Geralt enters her life at an angle that nothing in her experience had prepared her for. He's not impressed by her power. He has his own, of a different kind. He's not intimidated by her intelligence. His own is considerable, if differently applied. He's not performing the elaborate social dance that most people perform around sorceresses, because he is a witcher, and witchers do not perform the same social dances as everyone else. He simply responds to her as though she is a person, which is so unusual that her first response is suspicion, and her second response, arrived at some time later, is something that she does not have the vocabulary to name without it becoming complicated. What they have is not simple. It is not clean. They separate and reconnect and hurt each other, and save each other across years and countries and the occasional dimensional boundary in the way that people do when they are genuinely matched and genuinely incompatible simultaneously. The magic that binds them, the last wish, the Jinn's gift, the thing Geralt asked for in a moment of desperation, complicates the question of what they feel in ways that neither of them can fully resolve. Did the wish create the love? Or did the wish simply clear away the obstacles to love that was already present? The question is real, and it does not have an answer, which is the most honest thing about it. Yennefer's relationship with Ciri is different from Geralt's, and different again from what it superficially resembles: a teacher with a student, a mentor with a protégé. What it actually is, beneath those structures, is a woman who was denied the choice of motherhood finding, in this specific impossible girl, a child worth all the ferocity of the love she'd been told she would never be able to give. She will not call it that easily. She is not a woman who calls things easily, but it is visible in the way she teaches Ciri, pushing, demanding, refusing to let her settle for less than what she's capable of, and in the way she would, without hesitation, burn the world to keep her safe. The magic that Yennefer wields is chaos magic, the same energy that flooded the continent through the Conjunction's wounds, the same energy that the elder races experienced as a foreign intrusion into the world's natural systems. She has made something refined and beautiful and terrifying from it. The refinement did not make it less than what it was. It made it more concentrated, more precise, more capable of doing damage and doing healing, sometimes in the same motion. Chaos is not something Yennefer contains. It is something she has negotiated a working relationship with, on terms that continue to be renegotiated every time she pushes the power past the boundaries of what she has previously managed. In this, she is a perfect symbol of the Witcher world itself, something that was broken and then rebuilt, using the broken pieces into something that works differently than it was originally designed to work, but works nonetheless. The chaos energy that the conjunction unleashed is not clean. The world it created is not clean. Yennefer is not clean. She's capable and complicated and real, and that is far better. Rest now, gently. The cost of becoming is not always visible in the person who paid it. Yennefer looks like power, and she is power. Underneath the power, in the private geography of a woman who keeps her private geography very private indeed, is a girl who was told she was nothing and spent her whole life proving otherwise. That proof is still ongoing. It may always be ongoing. But she is not tired. She has never been tired in the way that defeats people. She's simply continuing, and that is its own kind of answer to the world's original mistake. Not resolution, just continuation. The choice to continue, made fresh every morning, against every available reason to stop. The question of whether the last wish created Geralt and Yennefer's bond or simply revealed it is one of those questions that the text presents without resolving, and the irresolution is the point. We do not know, and more importantly, they do not know, and the not knowing is what gives the relationship its particular quality of tension. Not dramatic tension, the kind that resolves, but existential tension, the kind that becomes the medium in which a relationship exists. Every time they are together, the question is present. Every time they choose each other, and they do choose each other repeatedly, across distances and disasters, and the full range of grievances that two very stubborn and very capable people can accumulate. The choice is complicated by the uncertainty about whether the choice is entirely theirs. Yennefer's response to this uncertainty is characteristically hers. She refuses to let it be the determining question. The wish happened. The bond is there. Whether the bond produced the feeling or the feeling produced the wish, or the two are inseparable, these are questions for philosophers with nothing more urgent to do. What is true is that she is here, and he is here, and the love, whatever it is made of, however it was assembled, is functional. It operates. It does the things love does. It causes her to act, repeatedly and at significant cost, in ways she would not act if she were acting solely in her own interest. This is, she would say, sufficient evidence. The rest is academic. The child of the elder blood was supposed to be Ciri's own biological child. This is the aspect of the NLA's plan that receives the least attention but is, when examined, the most disturbing. The NL did not simply want Ciri. They wanted Ciri to produce the next generation of elder blood, concentrated in a form they could control and cultivate. They wanted, in other words, to continue the breeding program that had produced Ciri, but this time with oversight, with intention, with the specific pairings that their geneticists and magical scholars had determined would produce the optimal expression of the bloodline in the next generation. Avallac'h's role in this plan is the darkest aspect of his character, and he is a character whose other aspects include considerable genuine care for Ciri's welfare. Both of these things are true simultaneously. This is not a contradiction. This is what complex people look like. Yennefer's destruction of the fertility that the chaos magic took from her is something she discusses only in fragments, and only with people she has decided to trust, which is a short list. With Ciri, she's more open about it than with almost anyone else, not because she has resolved it, but because Ciri is the thing that makes the resolution less urgent, not a replacement. She has been at pains to think of Ciri clearly and not to sentimentalize the relationship into something that simplifies both of them. Ciri is not the child Yennefer could have had. She is the child Yennefer has. The distinction matters because one is about loss and the other is about presence, and the second is more useful than the first. The magic that Yennefer wields in the final act of the saga, the acts of protection and violence and healing that she performs in the service of the people she loves, is not the chaos magic she was taught at Aretusa, though it draws on the same base energy. It is something more personal than that. Something shaped by who she has become over the decades since the transformation. A woman who knows the cost of power with exact precision and who has decided, having weighed the cost against the alternative, to pay it. The payment never ends. The cost never stops accumulating. And she pays it every time because the people she is paying it for are worth more than the cost, which is the only arithmetic she has ever found she can live with. Geralt once asked her, in one of the periods of relative peace that the story occasionally provides, whether she regretted the transformation. He asked it badly. It is the kind of question he asks when he has been thinking about it long enough that it has to come out without having had time to work out the form, and she gave him the kind of answer that his question probably deserved, which was sharp at the edges and true at the centre. She said she regretted many things. She regretted the cost of the transformation. She regretted that Tissaia had not told her what the cost was before it was extracted. She regretted a few specific decisions she had made in the first decades after Aretusa, when she was using her new power like a blunt instrument before she had learned to use it like a scalpel. But the transformation itself, becoming the person she was, with the capabilities she had, no, she did not regret that. She was not willing to regret that. It would be, she said, the most expensive waste of energy she had ever considered. Rest now. Yennefer is somewhere in the cold night of this world, wearing violet, carrying the weight of everything she has paid and everything she has chosen and everything she has refused to regret. She is not comfortable. She is almost never comfortable, but she is real and present and entirely herself, which is the only thing the transformation was ever supposed to produce, and the only thing that mattered in the end. What if destiny is not a cage? What if, in a world that was broken before it began, destiny is the only mercy it was ever given? What if destiny is not a cage? This is the question that runs beneath the entire Witcher saga like a current beneath still water. Felt more than seen, audible only when everything else is quiet. The world was broken before it began. The conjunction made it a vessel for everything from every other vessel, poured in without ceremony and without consent. In a world like that, built on a wound, what would mercy look like? Perhaps this, a force that moves through the chaos, connecting things that belong together, ensuring that the right people find each other in a universe that has every structural reason to keep them apart. Perhaps destiny, in the Witcher world, is not a sentence. It is a gift. We are near the end of tonight's long journey. Let your breathing settle into the slowest rhythm it can find without effort. There is nothing ahead of you in the dark but rest, and the particular sweetness of a mind that has travelled far and is now allowed to come home. The history we have walked through tonight is vast. It spans worlds and millennia, and the full arc of a civilizational mistake that remade everything it touched. But we are ending, as all good stories end, with something small, something human, a wish. Jinni exist in the Witcher world as a consequence of the conjunction. They arrived the same way everything else arrived, through the dimensional seams, from a sphere where they were either ordinary or extraordinary, into a world that had no framework for them, and so filed them under the category of beings that grant wishes, which is what the folk tradition does with things it cannot categorize. The Jinn are not obligated to grant wishes. They are not servile by nature. They are immensely powerful entities from another dimension who have been, through a combination of cultural expectation and magical constraint, placed in a position where their power is expressed through the mechanism of the wish. They do not appear to enjoy this. The third wish, always the third, always the final one, because the rules of the Jinn's operation have a grammar to them that persist regardless of the Jinn's own preferences, is the most powerful. It is also the most dangerous, because the granting of a wish at that magnitude requires a structural commitment from the wisher that the earlier wishes do not. The third wish binds in ways that cannot be unbounded. It creates connections that persist beyond the wish itself, beyond the moment of the granting, into the lives of everyone the wish touches. When Geralt used the third wish to bind his fate to Yennefer's, he was, depending on how you interpret the moment, either the most romantic or the most foolish person in the story, or both simultaneously, which is more likely. He was in a situation in which he was dying, and the Jinn was about to be free, and the rational calculation of the available options produced a choice that most people would describe as desperate rather than strategic. He wished for their fates to be intertwined. He wished for what he wanted, which was for her to live, expressed in the only form that the grammar of djinn wishes could accommodate. The NCD have a concept they call Gwynbleid, a term that means white wolf, which is what they call Geralt, and woven into the concept is a whole cosmology of how people and their destinies relate to each other. The elves, who are old enough to have developed nuanced frameworks for almost everything, understand fate not as a railroad but as a river. It has a direction, it has a general tendency, but it is shaped by the landscape it moves through, and the landscape is shaped by the river in turn. You cannot step outside the river. But the exact path it takes through a given territory is a collaboration between the water and the ground. Geralt's relationship to destiny is famously ambivalent. He says he does not believe in it. He says this repeatedly, with the conviction of a man who has decided to believe something and is maintaining the belief through repetition rather than evidence. The evidence, if he looked at it clearly, would suggest that destiny has been demonstrably present in his life in forms that are difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The law of surprise that bound Ciri to him before either of them knew the other existed. The repeated convergences that brought him and Yennefer together across impossible distances. The way that his particular combination of skills and ethical commitments positioned him, uniquely, to be the person the two most important women in the continent's history would trust with their lives. He does not look at the evidence clearly. This is not stupidity. Geralt is not stupid. It is a choice, made early and maintained with the same stubborn consistency he brings to all his choices, to experience the world on the terms he can control, rather than the terms the world is actually operating on. Control is important to a Witcher. The mutations gave him enhanced capabilities at the cost of the easy emotional availability that most people use to navigate uncertainty. In the absence of that availability, he constructed a philosophy of personal agency, the belief that what he does is what he chooses, and that fate is a story people tell to avoid the discomfort of choosing. It is worth sitting with this quietly at the very end of tonight's journey. The irony at the centre of Geralt's character is that the man who most insists on the irrelevance of destiny has been the most thoroughly shaped by it of anyone in the story. Every important relationship in his life, every person he has protected, every choice he has made when the choice mattered, has been on the path that the convergence of his specific history, his specific capabilities, and his specific ethical commitments made not just possible but almost inevitable. He did not plan to love Yennefer. He did not plan to claim Ciri. He did not plan to be the person the world needed him to be at the moments the world most needed someone to be it. He just kept making the next choice, and the choices accumulated into something that looks, from a sufficient distance, indistinguishable from fate. This is perhaps the deepest consolation that the Witcher world offers, and it is a modest one, as the best consolations tend to be. The universe's original mistake did not determine everything. The conjunction broke the world, yes. It deposited monsters. It flooded the continent with chaos energy. It brought humanity in its urgent, expanding, irresistible flood. It set in motion a countdown to the white frost that no one asked for. All of these things happened, and they continue to happen, and their consequences are real, and often terrible. And yet, within the broken world, something else also happens. People find each other, not despite the chaos, sometimes because of it, along the chaotic paths that a tidier universe might not have provided. A Witcher and a sorceress, bound by a wish that neither of them understands. A Witcher and a child connected by a law older than either of their traditions. A child who is also a weapon and also a person, and also, stubbornly herself. A world that was made wrong and has been, generation by generation, making itself slightly more right. The last wish is the story's spine. Not the wish itself, not the specific words Geralt spoke to the djinn in a moment of desperate love, but the principle it embodies, that in a world built on broken things, the act of choosing to be bound to something, to someone, is the closest thing available to grace. The djinn's third wish did not cure the conjunction. It did not heal the wound in the world's fabric. It did not prevent the wild hunt or resolve the prophecy or address the slow dying of the Enel. What it did was simpler, and in the long run, more durable. It ensured that two people who belonged together would find each other. Ciri, in the end, makes her own version of this choice, not through a djinn's mechanism, but through the raw power of the elder blood and the decision, made freely with full knowledge of the available alternatives, to use that power for something other than what anyone else's plan required of her. She does not save the world in the manner the prophecy specified. She saves it in the manner she specifies, which is different and which is hers. The God who made the Witcher world made one mistake, and it broke everything. But what was built on the ruins of the breaking was not nothing. It was difficult and complicated and morally ambiguous and occasionally horrifying. It was also at its best moments. A witcher riding a road at dusk, a sorceress watching over a sleeping child, an elf singing in a forest that is mostly gone but not entirely. Genuinely beautiful. Let your eyes close now, if they have not already. The world of the Witcher is still out there, somewhere in the dark beyond this quiet room, the roads, the contracts, the monsters with their terrible histories, the mages with their terrible certainties, the elder races with their terrible patience, the wild hunters with their terrible need. All of it continues, as stories continue, without requiring your attention. The stories will be here tomorrow. The history will keep. The wound at the centre of this world has not closed and will not close, but it has been lived in, and that is enough. That is sometimes everything. If you liked this journey tonight, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a topic you would like to explore in the quiet hours, leave it in the comments. Sleep well. Your watch is ended. The question of what happened to the continent after the story's end, after the political upheaval settled, after the mages were scattered and regathered, after the last of the Wild Hunt's riders had passed from the dimensional corridors and been accounted for, is a question that the surviving accounts answer differently, depending on who wrote them and what they needed the answer to be. The Imperial Chronicles favour a narrative of stabilisation under Nilfgaard's governance, which is the version that emphasises order restored and borders regularised. The Enseder oral traditions favour a narrative of continued loss, more forest, more homeland, more of the world that was theirs taken by the slow creep of a civilization that does not notice what it consumes. Neither version is wrong. Both are incomplete. The truth of what happened lives in the spaces between the official narratives, as the truth usually does. Geralt's fate is debated among scholars of the period, with an intensity that seems disproportionate until you understand what he represents. He's not simply a character whose biographical conclusion is unknown. He's the symbol of the question the Witcher world cannot stop asking. Is it possible for something made as a weapon to become something more? His survival, or his death at Rivia, the riot, the pogrom, the moment when ordinary human fear turned on everything it had decided was other, is not just a personal story. It is the world's verdict on whether the thing he had been reaching toward, the impossible project of living with integrity in a broken world, was something the world was willing to honour, or something it was ultimately going to punish. The answer, in the canonical ending, is both and neither. He survives. He finds Yennefer. They have time together that neither of them had planned for and both of them needed. The ordinary time, the unheroic time, the time that is not a quest or a crisis but simply life happening in the present tense. Ciri goes where she goes, carrying the elder blood and the accumulated education of everyone who loved her, into a future that the story leaves appropriately open. This is the right ending for a saga built on the premise that the world is broken. Not a resolution, not a healing, but a continuation. Life going on, imperfect and present and warm enough. The Druids of the Blue Mountains have a practice at the solstice, the deep winter solstice, when the night is longest and the cold is at its most persuasive, of sitting together in silence for the duration of 1 full hour before any celebration begins. Not in meditation exactly, not in prayer, simply in acknowledgement of the dark. They do not resist it, they do not fill it, they sit in it together and let the darkness be what it is, and then they light the first fire of the celebration, and the warmth is more real for having been preceded by the genuine dark. This is perhaps the closest thing the Witcher world offers to a spiritual practice that does not come with institutional complications. The acknowledgement of the dark, the sitting with it, and then the fire. Geralt's whole life is structured this way, though he would not describe it in these terms. He would probably say something sharp about druid practices and go back to whatever he was doing. But the structure is there, the darkness first, the acknowledgement that it is real, that it is cold, that it is not going to be wished away by a pleasant story, and then the fire, the warmth of the people he has chosen, the particular heat of a love he did not plan and cannot fully explain, and has decided to stop trying to explain. Tonight, in the quiet of the hours you're now entering, the darkness is entirely safe. It is the productive darkness of rest. The dark that the body requires, that the mind requires, that the accumulated weight of the day requires in order to become the morning. The monsters of the Witcher world sleep in it too, in their own fashion, in their own places. The mages are quiet in their towers. The Witchers are still on their roads, but the roads at night are different from the roads in the day. Slower, quieter, the hoofbeats absorbed by the soft ground, the lanterns small and specific against the general dark. The god that created the Witcher world made one mistake, and it broke everything. And from the breaking, a world was made. Not a perfect world, a real one. With real people in it, making choices in the dark, finding each other across distances that should have been impossible, choosing warmth over cold in a universe that tends toward cold, over and over, every day, which is all any of us ever do. Breathe out now. The stories will be here tomorrow, the road will still be there, and for now, in this moment, you have everything you need. If you like this journey tonight, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a topic you would like to explore in the quiet hours, leave it in the comments. Sleep well, your watch is ended.